I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My favourite memories of being on the farm was spending time with my father on Saturday mornings. I had two younger brothers who were both asthmatics, so they didn't spend time out on the farm, which made spending time with my dad more special to me. That was the only one-on-one time that I got to spend with him.
Andrew Facey, Brooklyn's father, is a wealthy fourth-generation real estate developer in Melbourne.
When I was a kid, I thought my dad was a superhero. He took over his father's real estate business when he was 18 years old, and he expanded the business very significantly.
Brooklyn's mother is a beautiful socialite.
I had a very difficult relationship with my mother. There was the expectation that I was going to be as thin and as beautiful as what she was. And it didn't seem to matter what I did. It was never good enough for her. And it's caused a significant amount of trauma in my life.
Brooklyn wants to follow in her father's footsteps one day, but here too, she meets with rejection.
My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially, and Brooklyn sets her sights on college. But then, disaster strikes.
When I was 18 years old, I had a head-on collision with a truck. I had a closed head injury, my face and jaw was smashed, and I have since had 54 orthopedic surgeries to rebuild my body. I spent most of the year either in a wheelchair or on crutches, but I managed to get through that year at college.
Brooklyn eventually finishes her degree, but rethinks her future.
I couldn't spend time standing and on my feet all day, which is what's required if you're in real estate. One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym after one of the surgeries. After my car accident, I felt like I had been smashed into pieces, and I felt that nobody was going to want me. So as soon as somebody did come along that appeared interested in me, I feel like I kind of latched on to that.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're going to have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
After 5 years of marriage, Brooklyn takes full custody of her sons with minimal resistance from her ex. A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
For anyone who's been a single mother, it's an exhausting gig. And I hoped that I would find someone who would come in and be a part of the family and contribute to that. So I signed up for an Australian dating online service.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He came across to her as very available. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
So the next night I went on my first date with Paul Carter. And that was a date with destiny, to say the least. Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomized Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We went out for dinner and we laughed and talked and got on great, and he was just very easy to talk to, and we just kind of clicked. He has a big personality and he is an amusing person to spend time with.
Paul is ambitious and has his sights set on a bright financial future as a real estate developer and independent business owner.
I needed a man that was going to step up, somebody that had the sort of alpha male qualities that my dad had. That's how Paul came across initially. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. I had come from being married to somebody who was really not physically interested in me at all. And he was this guy, he was very sexual and a great lover. And I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
My middle son was about 18 months old and my eldest son was about 4. And he got along great with them and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
He says that he can't see me this weekend. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I thought it was because he was trying to get stuff done. I ended up going to the South Melbourne market and I'm wandering around the market and I look up and here's Paul walking towards me hand in hand with a girl that I had no idea who she was. And he couldn't get her to let go of his hand fast enough. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just showing so-and-so around Melbourne. She's here visiting from Canada." And I couldn't even think at that point. Like, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was left standing there like an idiot, in shock. And when I finally got to ask him about it, his explanation was, "Oh, I was holding her hand because she was scared." She was scared. He claims that she just showed up unannounced. Nobody flies from Canada to Australia on a whim. I'm not somebody that strings people out or plays games, so I wasn't at that time familiar with being played the way that he was playing me. I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. His name on his driver's license was Paul Carter, but the address didn't really fit with the narrative that he was putting up about being this super successful guy and having all these designer brands and this flashy car. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was surreal. I have 2 little boys who are becoming quite attached to him. And there was a sideboard just inside the door and it had all these photos from their wedding, the pictures of the kids, pictures of his wife. And I felt like the ground was going to open up and swallow me.
Brooklyn Facey is reeling from the news that her new boyfriend, Paul Carter, is not the successful single man he claims to be. In fact, he's married with kids.
This was his second marriage that he was in. At that point, the first marriage, he had 3 kids. And he has a different last name. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if anything about him is real.
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, Yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together. It didn't sound unrealistic. I thought, this guy's got a lot of potential. He was an exciting person. He's not boring like my last husband was. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with boring.
After the painful confrontation, Paul divorces his second wife and moves into an apartment. And soon, the deception is in the rear view as he plays dad to a blended family with Brooklyn.
He had 3 young children. I had 2 young children. Their ages sort of meshed together. Every other weekend, we had all 5 of them. I loved having the kids there. It was a lot of work for sure, but my boys were happy to have playmates. Thought Paul was pretty good with helping with things around the house, and he was involved in everything that they were doing. So we had a pretty good team situation going on. It meant a great deal to me because I was looking for a partner.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I was thrilled. I was so excited. He convinced me that the life that we were going to have together was going to be wonderful. I didn't really get a sense that my parents didn't like him until I said to them that we were getting married, and they were not in favour of the idea. Right from the get-go, my father thought Paul was sketchy and he couldn't put his finger on it. But, you know, I was an adult. I was in my 30s by that stage, and I was going to do what I was going to do. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. My father came to the wedding. My mother did not come to the wedding. We had all the kids there, all dressed up in black pants and white shirts, and it was so beautiful. And everything seemed so perfect that day. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. And I was the mother in the family, and I was never going to let my kids feel lonely or sad or unloved. Just thought that was the beginning of the happily ever after. So after we got married, the first couple of years were kind of rough. I was dealing with chronic pain from my car accident, but I felt like Paul had my back. I felt like he was there for me. For the most part, he seemed to be on my team.
The couple doesn't have to worry about money. Brooklyn may be cut out of running the family business, but her dad is still supportive. They move into a bigger house, and when she starts feeling healthier, they take another big step.
We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac, who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
After Mac's birth, Brooklyn and Paul buy an outdoor equipment company to run as a family business.
I was hoping that it would be something that we could work together in, and then there would be like a legacy for our kids. I was working there part-time, and I was doing the books, and Paul was selling the items, and he was very creative with his marketing, and he would start selling things on eBay. My dad injected a very significant amount of money so we could try and, make a go of it. He was trying to protect me financially, and he wanted to help Paul create something that was going to be good for us.
But after 18 months, they don't have enough cash flow to replenish their stock.
Paul was spending more money than he was bringing in. It wasn't until he was working for something that I was involved in that I got a glimpse of his poor business practices. And my dad basically bailed us out of it. So once we lost the company, my dad then had that over me. And I was going to hear about that forever and a day, that he had saved me and that otherwise we would have been bankrupt. Paul really did a good job of putting a wedge between us.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs.
The organization provides housing for low-income families.
He manages to pull this great job with United Housing, a very secure job, paying very well, and I'm thinking, great, everything's back on track now. I had no idea that he was doing anything wrong at the time.
He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
Brooklyn and Paul have huge mortgage payments for the house they own together, and their debts are mounting because of Paul's excessive spending.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was telling me that Paul doesn't know what he's doing. I was humiliated, totally humiliated. The fact that Paul was so irresponsible with money was another reason that my dad felt that he was not a good influence on the boys and that they would be better off with their biological father. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
The custody battle continues for 3 years.
I had run out of money for lawyers. I had no chance of winning. No chance.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15. Perhaps influenced by their grandfather, they choose to side with their father.
So my ex-husband, he allowed my father to do this, and he really hasn't worked a day since then. There's only one thing that I really take pride in, and that is that I think I'm a good mum. And for me to lose my kids like that was just so devastating. If it wasn't for Mac, it would have been the end of me.
But for Brooklyn, these losses are just the beginning. Brooklyn Carter is staggering from the heartbreaking loss of her custody battle.
My family, I have no connection with because they've all taken my dad's side. I've lost 2 of my sons, so all I have left is my youngest son and my husband. It would have been easier for me if I had died that day. Everything that I had tried to keep safe and everything that mattered to me had just been handed over to someone else. And I just hope that when my boys are older, they realize that I never, ever stopped loving them. For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. He felt that he was missing out on time and energy that I should have been putting into him. He was going to motocross meetings and joining motocross clubs. He was buying cars and changing cars frequently.
Paul would use Brooklyn to subsidise his lifestyle, things like fast cars, properties, credit cards.
There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid.
Brooklyn has managed to protect a portion of her nest egg from Paul's spending, but she's concerned he might eventually drain all of her money.
I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. And my version of that was to take my money and put it somewhere else where Paul couldn't touch it, and I knew it would be safe. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, just as Brooklyn ties up her finances with offshore real estate and her money is out of his reach, Paul comes into a windfall.
On my son Mac's 5th birthday, we were having a party at our house for him, and Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through.
Paul explains that this land is in Italy, and the sale is slightly delayed by red tape.
He showed me some documentation, and it all looked very bona fide to me, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's one of the things about Paul. He always bounces back, often bigger and better than he was before.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest.
It was very difficult for my youngest son to come home every night and not have his brothers there and go to the same school and not see his brothers.
Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life.
Brooklyn and Mac head to Boston in April of 2014.
I was still devastated about my sons, but it was easier to try and move forward when I wasn't faced with the same things every day that reminded me of them. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. Then suddenly the communication starts to dwindle and he's not calling every day. He didn't contact me for my birthday. It didn't take long for me to question him about what was going on. So he says to me, I would finish these jobs a lot quicker if you can fund them, and then once I finish them, I'll get the final payment and then I'll repay you.
Brooklyn knows that lending money to Paul is a risk, but after 11 years of marriage, she doesn't want to give up on him.
I don't like quitters, and I don't like to quit on things myself. I'm going to stick with something until the very end. So I went ahead and gave him the money.
It won't be long before Brooklyn discovers the real purpose of the money.
It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, "Who is this lady in the picture with Dad?" Somebody had sent him a Facebook notification. Hang on, is this an old picture of Paul? This is my husband, but I've got no idea who this woman is. Paul's wearing a black tie suit, and this blonde woman is wearing what looks like a ball gown. I had no idea when the photo was taken, who this woman was, what Paul was doing there, or what the event was. I felt sick. I felt like my whole life was spinning out of control.
Brooklyn Carter is mortified to discover pictures of her husband in the very close company of another woman.
I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. Paul rocked up to that date driving a Maserati and claimed he owned a big fleet of them. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire with this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland.
The courtship begins after Brooklyn leaves for Boston.
Catherine said it was something of a whirlwind romance. He was extremely kind, he paid a lot of attention to her, and came across as extremely committed. She decided to move in with him, and to her shock, he lived in this basic townhouse in Box Hill, which is certainly not where you'd think a multimillionaire lives. Paul had an explanation, and that was that this was a temporary place that he was living while he and his ex-partner had been building this dream home. He actually told her his ex-wife had passed away with brain cancer, so she stopped asking questions. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. Catherine owned a beauty bar just outside of Melbourne, and it was to be acquired by the government to make way for a major road project. Catherine said that Paul really convinced her that he was something of an acquisitions expert, and so she was quick to transfer him power of attorney.
With Brooklyn conveniently tucked away in Boston, Paul Carter feels confident that he's safe to openly celebrate his new love. But he fails to consider the massive reach of social media.
After several months of me questioning whether he was having an affair or he was becoming more and more distant, I finally had the proof. So I called him and I said to him, "What the hell is this? What is going on?" He said that he would come over to Boston, and in the meantime we were doing counselling over the phone and trying to figure out if this was at all salvageable.
In Australia, Catherine Dubois receives a very similar shock.
After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul. And they tell her, he has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this. Catherine now believes that he was trying to take over the beauty salon that she'd transferred into his name.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work. I still felt like I could pull out the defibrillator once again and restart the heart and try and get things back on track.
On a romantic trip to New York City for Brooklyn's 46th birthday, Paul tells her he wants to renew his commitment to her.
We had a lovely weekend in New York City, and he had organised with a jeweller to look at some diamonds because he was going to get a ring made for me.
But within weeks, it becomes clear she'll never get that diamond ring.
The money hasn't been transferred to the jeweller. No money has come into our accounts. I had faced about as much humiliation as I could take at this point. I was really losing faith in Paul. But I want to be able to say to my kids that I gave it my best shot. I didn't just quit because it got too hard. I just wasn't prepared to lose all that money and then find out a couple of weeks later that he inherited tens of millions of dollars from his grandmother.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
Paul spent many years convincing Brooklyn that he was to inherit, and every time this deal was due to close, there was always an excuse as to why it wasn't happening. He would go to extreme lengths to keep up the con. fake contracts written in Italian would be delivered to her door, and another time that she'd receive calls from a fake number explaining to her why this was being delayed.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklyn puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief. And this turns into his breaking point.
Paul came home and said, there's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming, there's no money. I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklyn kicks Paul out.
I was now left with this farm that I had to pay for. I enlisted the support of my dad to help figure out the financial part of it until I was able to sell my house and repay him. Fortunately for me, my father made me sign a prenup with Paul, so I didn't end up having to split our assets. Finally, I had control of my life back again from Paul Carter. Or so I thought.
Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
Paul shows up to the farm. He was really angry. And he says to me, I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me. And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklyn Carter is finally coming clean with herself about who her husband really is. And she's terrified.
He was not in control of money, property, our child, nothing. The gravy train had well and truly stopped, and it just enraged him. I went out and bought myself a rifle. My son was sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed. I was terrified of what might happen.
Brooklyn gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce.
I couldn't lose any more money, I couldn't lose any more sleep, I couldn't be any more miserable. I thought, if I don't do something now, I'm not even going to have the energy to get out of this marriage.
In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklyn gets full custody of Mac.
I couldn't hold back my emotion, and I burst into tears, and my head fell onto the desk in the courtroom.
But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. I decided I needed to get Mac and I a new visa. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklyn and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019.
She was going to come and live at the house that I had built at my farm, and we were just going to grow old together and help each other out and be companions for each other.
Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
I get a call from 60 Minutes Australia.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men, a ruthless operator who's fleeced millions from family, friends, the rich and the poor.
60 Minutes seemed to have even more information about things that he had done that I had no clue about.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
They tracked him down at a job site, which was a very rewarding moment to see because they made him come down off the roof and it was just perfect.
Why would you tell Catherine that your partner had died of bone cancer?
Yeah, that was a mistake. I was going through a bad time with my then wife and it was just a mistake.
They knew about the Uniting Church fiasco and they just had facts and figures and numbers on different projects that he was doing. He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just deny.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that another mistake?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
He had engaged in these fraud schemes for many years with almost no law enforcement intervention. We were able to determine that he had used multiple identities. At that time, his most recent name is Paul Hamilton. We execute a search warrant at his residence. We found a law diploma under the name of Paul Hamilton. We found a document that was fraudulent from the Department of Homeland Security indicating that he had been awarded United States citizenship. We found military uniforms in his closet. We found a document indicating that he was the beneficiary of over $30 million in trust funds. All of these items were in line with what the underlying allegations were about him. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
This should have been the end of Brooklyn's nightmare with Paul, except that her marriage to him has put her under the microscope of Homeland Security as well.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
The execution of the search warrant at Brooklyn's house was specifically in regard to the allegations of marriage fraud against her.
They're bashing on the door. Open the door, Brooklyn. So I opened the door, and 8 agents in bulletproof vests with guns stormed through my door and up the stairs. They took all our cell phones and computers, took my son's gaming computer, everything that they could get their hands on, and sent it to Quantico to get analysed.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government. This was supposed to be a happy situation for both of us.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
They never charged me with marriage fraud, but it was enough for them to then look at the ESTA form that I'd filled in and decide, oh, well, that's not right either. There was a felony charge for filling in the ESTA while I was still in the United States.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court, and despite the many allegations, he too is charged with visa fraud on April 7th, 2021, and held in an Albany jail.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
His deportation hearing has been delayed, and now he has moved to the other side of the country and applied for a green card. So it seems that he's bought himself another couple of years of stalling techniques.
I think based on his history, it's likely that he'll come back around. I'd be surprised if we haven't heard the last of Paul Carter.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I heard that she had to leave the country, and I said, I'm gonna marry you, and I'm gonna get your son away from Paul. And if he'll have me and you'll allow it, I'm going to adopt him and make him a Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've brought chaos to this man's life, and he's still there standing right beside me. And I believe he will be till our dying days.
We're happy as can be now. We are not going to let anybody shatter our marriage. And I'll be with Brooklyn as soon as I can in another country at the soonest available time.
I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.
It begins with a door that never closed properly, a hallway light that flickered without reason, and a silence so heavy that neighbours still swear they felt it pressing against their chests the night everything went wrong. In the winter of 2003, Berlin was drowning in a cold that seeped beneath coats and into bones. But nothing froze the city more than the disappearance of a young woman who walked into her apartment and somehow vanished between one breath and the next. Her name whispered through stairwells, echoed in news bulletins, carved itself into community fear until people spoke softly in elevators, checking shadows behind them as if the air itself hid a predator. And now, 2 decades later, a confession rattles the nation, bringing every unanswered question roaring back to life. The story begins on a Monday evening that smelled of wet pavement and cigarette smoke drifting from open windows. The woman, 26, lived alone on the 3rd floor of a narrow building whose walls carried every sound: footsteps, arguments, laughter, the creak of aging pipes. She had returned from work just before 7 p.m., grocery bag in hand, keys dangling from a frozen red fist. She passed her neighbour on the staircase, an elderly man who later told police she looked tired, distracted, as though replaying something urgent in her mind. That observation would soon become the first of many strange details swirling around the case, small, unanchored moments that resisted explanation. The hallway camera caught her entering. The grainy footage showed the door closing behind her. No one else went in. No one else came out. 37 hours later, when officers forced themselves through the same door, her apartment sat untouched, lights still on, a mug still warm on the counter as if time had paused mid-sip. But she was gone. No struggle. No sign of forced entry. No indication of where she might have fled. Just silence, thick, unnatural, suffocating. Her disappearance struck Berlin like a shockwave. News anchors repeated the same phrase with rising alarm: "A cold case in the making." Posters spread across train stations. Strangers uploaded shaky videos analyzing the hallway footage frame by frame. The mystery wasn't just that she disappeared, it was how she disappeared. A sealed room. A locked door. A vanishing act with no magician. People began calling it the 3rd floor ghost case. Detectives hated the name, but they had no better explanation to offer. Inside the apartment, investigators found items arranged with eerie neatness: shoes aligned beside the bed, coat folded over a chair, cell phone abandoned on the kitchen table with a half-typed message on the screen: "I think someone is in," and the message stopped there. No period. No send. The cursor blinked for years like a heartbeat trapped under glass. But the case lacked the one thing that could expose the truth: evidence. Not a fingerprint out of place, not a footprint in the snow outside, not a witness who saw anything other than the mundane routine of a woman returning home. As weeks passed, the story twisted from disaster to obsession. Friends replayed their last conversations, hunting for hidden warnings. Her mother refused interviews but stood at her window every night, convinced she'd see her daughter walking up the street. Forensic teams returned again and again, dismantling floorboards, testing dust, scanning walls, but everything they touched told them nothing. It was as if the apartment itself was determined to protect a secret. Berlin grew restless. Late-night talk shows speculated about everything from a stalker to a professional abduction to supernatural intervention. A tabloid headline screamed, "A locked room mystery terrifies city. Is Berlin safe?" Politicians urged calm. Police urged patience. But communities whispered fear into every narrow alley and busy market. People began double-locking their doors, installing peepholes, checking behind shower curtains. The city was alive with paranoia. And then came the first break, small, fragile, and tragically misleading. A woman reported seeing someone who looked like the victim aboarding a bus near Alexanderplatz. Police swarmed the area. Footage was reviewed, witnesses questioned. It led nowhere. Another tip claimed she was spotted outside a rural gas station. Another said she was seen in Prague. Another said she'd joined a cult. Each thread snapped the moment detectives tugged it. The investigation spiraled into an endless maze of speculation. Years passed like slow-moving ghosts. Evidence degraded. Witness memories blurred. Detectives retired. The cold case unit inherited the file, heavier with dust than answers. They reopened it every few years, each time encountering the same brick wall. A missing woman. No suspects. No motive. No confession. Until now. But before reaching the confession, the voice that shook the nation, we must return to the chilling detail that kept investigators awake for years, the sound reported by the neighbor directly beneath her apartment. At 22:13 on the night she vanished, he claimed he heard a soft, dragging noise above him, slow, heavy, rhythmic, like furniture being pushed across the floor. But when officers examined the apartment, nothing had moved. The chairs were aligned. The table untouched. The bed perfectly centered. And yet the neighbor insisted the noise lasted nearly 2 minutes. He had turned off his television just to listen, uneasy without knowing why. It was the kind of testimony that felt important, but importance alone couldn't make it useful. The report was logged, analyzed, then buried beneath dozens of other fruitless leads. Still, the dragging sound became a quiet obsession within the department. What could move for 2 minutes but leave no trace? What could create noise without disrupting a single object? And why had she typed a message about someone being in the apartment right before that chilling sound? The questions began to breathe on their own. Her case files mention another unsettling detail. In the days before she vanished, she had told a coworker that she felt followed, although she couldn't explain by whom or why. She described shadows lingering too long, footsteps echoing behind her when streets were empty, the feeling of eyes watching from corners she didn't dare turn toward. The co-worker assumed stress. Berlin winters can erode the spirit. But now, those words read like warnings swallowed by time. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered one more oddity. Her door lock showed chemical residue consistent with an attempted pick not on the night of her disappearance, but roughly 1 week earlier. She had not reported any break-in. She had not changed her locks. Whether she even knew someone had tried to enter remains a haunting uncertainty. But nothing, no strange noise, no typed message, no whispered fear, prepared investigators for the revelation found on page 47 of the evidence log. The missing woman had kept a journal. And in its final entry, written in shaky handwriting, she described waking up at 3:21 a.m. to the sound of breathing inside her room. She wrote that she froze, unable to tell whether the sound came from her imagination or the darkness pooling beneath her window. She turned on the lamp. Nothing was there. But she wrote that the breathing had felt familiar, as if she had heard it before, behind her on a crowded street, in the building stairwell, outside her door one night when she returned home late and found the hallway too quiet. Investigators believed she may have had a stalker. But they could not prove it. No DNA. No fingerprints. No suspicious accounts. No signs of forced entry. If someone had been in that apartment, they were a ghost, one who left no trace except terror. The case stalled completely by 2007. Files boxed. Evidence stored. Journal sealed. The cold case hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. And yet, even in dormancy, stories breathe. Rumors shift. Truth fractures, then reforms. Now, 20 years later, as a man walks into a Berlin police station and utters the words, "I need to confess to something from 2003, everything buried awakens." But this is only the threshold. Before the nation hears his story, before detectives uncover the past he claims to hold, before the cold case erupts back into a national nightmare, there is still one unresolved question that has haunted every investigator who ever touched the file. How does a woman vanish from a sealed room without leaving the slightest mark of her final moment? Even now, the apartment stands unchanged, as if guarding the truth with walls that refuse to speak. And somewhere inside the silence, the dragging sound continues its slow, invisible path, a reminder that some mysteries don't fade with time, they sharpen. And in this story, the sharpest edges are still waiting. The man who walked into the precinct wasn't the type anyone expected to break open a 2-decade mystery. He didn't fit the headlines, didn't resemble the caricature of a monster that newspapers had circulated in speculative sketches years earlier. He looked ordinary, painfully ordinary, with the posture of someone burdened not by guilt but by exhaustion, as if he'd carried a secret so heavy that it bent his spine. The officers at the front desk barely glanced up at first, accustomed to late-night confessions fueled by alcohol or loneliness. But when he placed his hands on the counter and whispered, "I'm here about the woman who disappeared in 2003, the 3rd floor," the room shifted. Conversations paused. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the overhead lights seemed to hum differently. They brought him into interview room 2, a cramped space with walls painted in the kind of beige that blurs time. He sat down, fingers trembling despite the stillness he tried to project. A detective activated the recorder, and the man's eyes flicked toward the red light. Something inside him recoiled, but he didn't run. Instead, he exhaled, long and steady, like a diver preparing for the depths. When he finally spoke, his words came out thin, barely audible, yet sharp enough to slice through every doubt. "I was there." The room didn't breathe for a moment. The detective asked what he meant. "There, where?" The man swallowed hard. "In her apartment. That night." His voice cracked. "I didn't kill her. But I saw what happened." The sentence traveled through the building like electricity. Officers lifted their heads. A cold case team member froze mid-step. A lieutenant cancelled his evening plan with a single nod. For 20 years, they'd waited for a thread, just one thread, to pull. And now, someone sat in interview room 2 claiming he had watched the unimaginable unfold behind the locked door that defined the case. Yet the man didn't gloat. He didn't posture. He trembled, legs bouncing uncontrollably beneath the table. His confession didn't feel rehearsed. It felt dragged out of him by something relentless and unforgiving. Detectives began their questions, methodical but careful, afraid that one misstep might send him spiraling into silence. They asked his name. He provided it, quietly, almost apologetically. They asked his age in 2003. He answered. They asked how he knew the victim. He hesitated long enough for the room to tense. "I didn't," he finally said. "I only knew her from the building." The building. A detail that hit investigators like a physical blow. For 2 decades, suspicion had hovered over residents, but nothing tied any of them to the disappearance. Background checks, interviews, surveillance logs, everything had come up clean. But now, this man claimed proximity deeper than anyone had admitted. "What were you doing in her apartment?" the detective asked. His eyes dropped to his hands, twisting together in a frantic rhythm. I need you to understand something, he said, voice cracking. I didn't intend to go inside. I didn't plan anything. I heard a noise. It sounded like someone calling for help. I knocked. No one answered. I panicked. The door, it wasn't locked properly. A lie, the detective thought immediately. The 2003 forensic report clearly stated the door was locked. But they didn't interrupt. They let him talk, knowing confessions unravel at their own pace. She was in the living room, he said. Standing completely still. Like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I called her name, but she didn't react. Then she looked toward the hallway, and that's when it started. The man's breathing shifted, shallow and uneven. He asked for water. He gripped the cup so tightly the rim dented. There was someone else in the apartment, he continued, voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't see him come in. I didn't see him until he moved. He stepped out of the shadow like he'd been part of the wall. The detectives exchanged glances, careful not to show skepticism too quickly. The 2003 apartment layout was verified repeatedly, no blind spots large enough for someone to hide without being found during countless searches. No secondary entrance. No crawl space. No illusionary angles. But the man insisted. He grabbed her, he said. But he didn't drag her like you'd expect. He held her still, like he was whispering something in her ear. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She looked calm. Too calm. The tension in the room thickened. This detail collided violently with what investigators knew. There were no signs of struggle. No bruises documented from earlier sightings. No overturned furniture. Just the quiet, unnatural stillness they remembered from the scene. The man continued, hands now gripping the edges of his chair. I tried to leave. But he saw me. His eyes, I don't know how to describe them. Empty, but not the kind of empty you see in criminals. It was like he didn't care whether I was there or not. He stopped speaking, staring at the floor as though reliving the moment frame by frame. Detectives gave him space, but not too much. Silence can shatter confessions as easily as pressure. What happened next? E1 asked. He looked up, and for a heartbeat, they saw a fear not easily faked. They walked down the hallway together. She followed him willingly. And then they both went into the bedroom. I heard the dragging sound from there. A shockwave ricocheted through every investigator in the building. The dragging sound. The one detail they could never erase, never explain, never stop replaying in endless internal debates. Each time they had examined the apartment, not a piece of furniture had shifted. Nothing heavy had moved. Yet this man described the exact sound reported by the neighbor beneath her unit, down to its slow rhythm. What was being dragged? Ere the detective pressed. The man squeezed his eyes shut. I don't know. It didn't sound like furniture. It sounded like something thick. Something soft. Like fabric. Fabric. A detail that drove one detective's pulse upward. In the earliest stages of the investigation, a theory, quickly dismissed, suggested she might have been wrapped in something before being removed. But no scent traces, no fibers, nothing supported it. Still, hearing the word now felt like a thread brushing against a matchstick. When the noise stopped, the man said, I opened the door a little. I shouldn't have. I know that now. The bedroom was dark, but I saw his breath caught. I saw the man standing alone. She wasn't there anymore. Detectives leaned forward. Every muscle in the room tightened like a coil. What do you mean she wasn't there? He shook his head violently, rubbing his hands against his jeans. She was gone. Completely gone. Like she had melted into the darkness. I swear there was no body on the floor. No one hiding. Just the man. What did he do? He walked toward the window, the man whispered. And for a second, I thought he was going to climb out. But he didn't. He just stood there, looking down at the street. Then he turned his head toward me and smiled. A suffocating pause filled the room. And then, the detective urged. And then I ran. He said it with such raw terror that the interviewer almost believed the truth lay exactly as spoken. But truth in cold cases is never simple. It arrives fractured, distorted by time, warped by guilt or fear or fantasy. Detectives had to dissect every word, cross-reference every detail, compare it to evidence that had slept in storage boxes for years. They asked him why he never came forward sooner. He stared at the table. Because no one would believe me. I barely believed myself. Every time I convinced myself I imagined it, something would remind me of that night. A noise. A shadow. A headline. And then the nightmares. Nightmares. Investigators took note. Confessions wrapped in trauma often carried pieces of truth, even if surrounded by illusion. But what struck them most was a final, chilling detail he revealed without prompting. He said that when he fled the apartment, the hallway light flickered. He described the exact irregular rhythm investigators had documented in 2003. A detail never released publicly. A detail that had never been printed in newspapers. A detail known only to those who stood on that hallway floor 20 years ago. The room filled with the silent weight of something unmistakable. The man knew things he shouldn't know. But his confession did not answer the central question. It complicated it. It twisted it. It breathed new life into old terror. Because no matter what he claimed to have seen, there was still the impossible truth investigators could never escape. The building's main door remained locked until officers broke it open. No one entered. No one left. The logs didn't lie. And yet he insisted he saw another man. He insisted the victim followed him willingly. He insisted she vanished before his eyes. And the worst part, the part that kept investigators rooted to their chairs, was the expression on his face as he spoke. Not pride. Not deceit. Not relief. Just the hollow dread of someone who had carried a nightmare for 20 years and had finally realized that speaking it aloud did not free him, it merely made it real again. Somewhere in Berlin, after 2 decades of silence, the cold case had begun to breathe. And the nation held its breath with it. The confession should have brought clarity, but instead it ruptured the investigation wide open, spilling confusion across every inch of the cold case unit's walls. Detectives spent the rest of the night replaying the man's words, scrutinizing every tremble of his voice, every shift of his eyes, every detail he should not have known yet somehow did. By sunrise, Berlin's sky stretched in a washed-out grey, the kind that erases color from the city and leaves only outlines, as if preparing the stage for a story too dark to be told in daylight. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights hummed with an artificial calm that contradicted the chaos building inside the detectives' minds. They placed the man in a holding room while they pulled old files from storage, boxes stacked like caskets filled with paper ghosts. Dust lifted into the air as they opened the lids, settling over their sleeves like a reminder that the past was never truly dormant. They dug out the photographs, the apartment, the hallway, the bedroom, the untouched furniture. They compared them with the details the man provided. The flickering hallway light. The dragging sound. The odd calmness of the victim. The sense of another presence in the room. Every detail aligned disturbingly well with witness accounts and forensic notations that had never been made public. Yet alignment didn't equal truth. Anyone deeply obsessed with the case could have pieced together fragments. Cold case forums existed. Amateur sleuths combed through scraps of rumors. But no one, no outsider, could have known the precise flicker pattern of that hallway bulb. The detective who documented it remembered how the light seemed to blink irregularly, then shine too brightly for a second, like it was straining against something unseen. It had bothered him so deeply he wrote a note about it in the margins of the incident report. That note never left the case file. And now, 20 years later, a stranger had described it exactly. But stranger, was he truly that? Records showed he had lived in the same building for 5 years, moved out in 2004 without forwarding information, and vanished into ordinary life somewhere else. Background checks revealed nothing alarming. No criminal history, no documented violent behavior, no restraining orders, not even a parking violation. A quiet man. A forgettable man. Someone who could fade into a crowd without effort. Yet the quietest people often carry the heaviest shadows. Detectives pulled his old lease, his employment file, his medical records. All signs pointed to normalcy, but the kind of normal that felt like camouflage. They brought in a psychological specialist who observed him through the holding room glass, a woman with decades of experience deciphering fabricated confessions from genuine trauma. She studied the tremors in his fingertips, the twitch in his jaw, the way he didn't look at the door but instead at the corners of the room, as if expecting something to emerge. When asked for her gut impression, she said only, "He is not lying." But he might not understand what he saw. Meanwhile, news of the confession leaked before noon. Cameras swarmed outside the precinct, reporters shouting over one another, headlines updating every minute, a Berlin cold case breakthrough. Confession after 20 years. Man claims he witnessed vanishing. Social networks erupted with theories ranging from rational to unhinged. Former residents of the building posted shaken memories of strange nights, unexplained noises, doors that swayed open by themselves. A woman claimed she once saw someone standing at the victim's window at 3 a.m., though she couldn't be sure. Another claimed she smelled something metallic in the hallway the week after the disappearance, different from the usual scent of old pipes. Inside, detectives ignored the noise and focused on the one thing that mattered, whether the man's story aligned with the physical constraints of the apartment. They brought up the original schematics, precise blueprints showing every angle, every beam, every possible hiding place. And that's where the first true fracture appeared. There was no space, none at all, for a second person to hide undetected, even briefly. The man's description of someone is stepping out of the shadow as if part of the wall contradicted every measurable reality of the room. Unless, detectives whispered to one another, he hadn't meant it literally. Trauma twists perception. Fear bends memory. Shadows grow larger in hindsight. But then another detail surfaced, a detail no one, not even the most obsessive amateur sleuth, could know. In his confession, the man described the exact angle of her bedroom window, a slight inward tilt that was documented as a structural error in the building's renovation plans. Only residents of that floor knew about it. Investigators had never mentioned it publicly. And yet he described how the man he saw stood near that window, head slightly turned, as if aligning himself with the crooked frame. That detail alone made the detectives' blood run cold. They decided to bring him back into the interview room for a second round of questioning. This time, not to hear his confession, but to tear it apart, to stress test every moment he claimed to have witnessed. They asked him where he stood in the apartment. He pointed to a spot detectives recognized instantly, the one place the bedroom door lined perfectly with the hallway mirror. A spot from which one could see partial reflections inside the room if the angle was precise. But he shouldn't have known that. No diagram showed it. No reenactment mentioned it. And the mirror itself had been removed years before investigators filmed walk-through footage. "How did you see into the bedroom?" the detective asked. "I didn't," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Not directly. I saw the movement. I saw the shadow shift. I saw her disappear from the doorway. And then I saw him standing where she had been." The detective pressed him harder. "You said she followed him willingly. Are you sure?" He blinked several times, staring into a distance only he could see. She wasn't afraid. That's what terrified me the most. Her face looked peaceful, like she'd been waiting for him. A sharp chill sliced through the air. Waiting for him, those were the exact words her coworker had used when describing her demeanor a week before the disappearance. A strange calmness. A sense of anticipation. As if she knew something was coming but didn't fear it. The interview continued, each question peeling back layers of the man's memory. He explained that after he ran out, he didn't alert anyone because he believed he had stepped into something he wasn't meant to witness. He felt watched for weeks after. He heard footsteps behind him at night, even when walking alone. He claimed his apartment door would sometimes rattle quietly at dawn. He moved out abruptly in 2004 because he couldn't sleep without seeing that smile, the one the man gave me before I fled. Still, detectives needed something concrete. Something physical. So they asked the question that had haunted them since 2003. How did the man get out of the building? The witness hesitated, then whispered, "I don't think he used the door." "What does that mean?" the detective demanded. He pressed his trembling fingers against his temples. "I mean he wasn't there when I looked back. Not even a second later. Like he slipped into the darkness beside the window and dissolved." Hallucination, one detective thought. Severe trauma. But another detective, one who had stood inside that same apartment in 2003, felt a cold memory rising, a gust of icy wind that had swept through the room despite sealed windows. He remembered his own notes, an unusual draft. Source unknown. The psychological specialist stepped into the room, gently redirecting the questioning. She asked the man what he felt in the apartment, not what he saw. His answer made the room fall silent. "It felt heavy. Like something was pressing on my chest. Like the air had weight." He paused, struggling for words. Like the apartment wasn't empty even when no one moved. The specialist exchanged a look with the lead detective, one filled not with belief, but with recognition. Several investigators from 2003 had reported feeling unwell inside that apartment. One fainted briefly during the search. Another claimed the lights dimmed for a moment, even though electricians confirmed the wiring was stable. None of this had made it into official reports. They chalked it up to stress, exhaustion, imagination. But now, hearing this man describe the same sensations, the same heaviness, the same oppressive air, it made their skin tighten. Still, they could not rely on feelings. They needed facts. They asked the final, most dangerous question of the night. Why did you come forward now? His answer was barely audible. Because he came back. Every detective froze. The man continued, voice quivering. 3 nights ago. I woke up to the sound of breathing in my room. Slow. Deep. Familiar. I turned on the light and saw nothing. But the window was open. And I knew he was reminding me that I never told the truth. The precinct grew colder with each word. His real, the man whispered. And his still watching. For the first time since the confession began, detectives felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in years: fear. Not of the man sitting before them, but of the possibility that the cold case wasn't just a story buried in the past. It was alive. Moving. Circling them. And somewhere in Berlin, something long silent had stirred awake. The moment the man whispered that the figure had come back, the precinct shifted into a tension so thick it felt like dust settling inside lungs. Detectives who moments earlier had approached the case with hardened skepticism now found themselves glancing toward corners of the room, as if expecting something to move there. Fear spreads quickly when rooted in something unexplainable, and cold cases a fertile soil for unexplainable things. Still, procedure demanded control, demanded logic, demanded a tether to reality even when that reality trembled underfoot. They transferred the man to a secure observation cell, not because they feared he was dangerous, but because the idea that something, or someone, might try to reach him again felt suddenly, disturbingly plausible. 2 officers monitored him constantly, their eyes flicking from him to the shadows behind him, unsure which one they truly needed to watch. Meanwhile, in the briefing room, the cold case unit gathered around a table littered with files, photos, and half-finished coffee cups shaking in anxious hands. The lead detective inhaled sharply, the kind of breath someone takes before stepping into freezing water. "We need to test his account," he said. "Everything. Even the parts that don't make sense." They pulled out the original structural plans of the building, old, yellowing pages marked with notes from the 2003 investigation. The architecture firm that renovated the structure had gone bankrupt years earlier, but the plans remained in city archives. Detectives scanned each line, searching for anything that might support the man's claims. Hidden alcoves. Hollow walls. Access panels. Anomalies. But all they found were clean, solid lines and measurements that left no room for shadows large enough to hide a person. Still, doubts persisted, gnawing at them like teeth against glass. One detective pointed to the bedroom window, the one with the slight inward tilt. "If the angle is wrong," he said quietly, "and maybe the drafts we felt weren't just ventilation floors." His colleagues stared at him, uncertain whether he was joking or slowly unraveling. He wasn't joking. They decided to return to the apartment. By afternoon, rain swept across Berlin in thin, icy curtains that blurred the city's edges. The building where the disappearance occurred still stood, weathered, repainted, renovated in small ways, but unmistakably the same. Tenants came and went through the entrance, holding umbrellas that dripped onto the floor tiles like falling time. When detectives approached, several residents recognized their badges immediately, fear flickering in their eyes. The cold case had never truly left the building. It lived in whispers behind doors, in the hollow quiet of the stairwell, in the way people instinctively avoided the 3rd floor after dusk. The current tenant of the victim's former apartment, a soft-spoken young woman who had moved in 18 months earlier, answered the door with a nervous smile that betrayed deeper unease. She admitted she'd always felt a strange energy in the space, but had dismissed it as superstition. She stepped aside, letting investigators in, clutching her sweater as though bracing against a draft that hadn't yet appeared. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than it did in the photographs, more confined, the walls pressing inward as if listening. Detectives scanned the living room. The layout had changed, furniture rearranged, personal touches everywhere, but the bones of the space were unmistakable. One of them closed his eyes, recalling the cold that clung to his skin 2 decades earlier. He felt it again, faint but real, like breath against his neck. They moved to the hallway. The light fixture had been replaced, modernized, but the spot where the old bulb flickered still felt charged with memory. One detective reached up and brushed his fingers across the ceiling surface. The plaster felt colder there. He didn't comment. In the bedroom, the crooked window remained. Renovations had never corrected the angle. The structural floor was too deep. A draft slipped through its edges despite proper sealing. The detective who fainted in 2003 stood before the window now, jaw locked, pulse echoing in his ears. He placed a hand against the glass. It vibrated, softly, almost imperceptibly, as if something pressed from the other side. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" his colleague asked. But he didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure if it was a sound or a memory. They inspected every square centimetre of the room: walls, floorboards, vents, ceiling beams. Nothing suggested a hidden space. No loose panels. No discoloration. No abnormal hollowness when tapped. The physics of the apartment were unbendable. Yet the man's confession refused to fit inside those physics. As detectives documented the room with updated photographs, the new tenant spoke softly, her voice trembling. "I know this sounds strange," as she said, "but I've heard things." All eyes turned to her. She swallowed hard. "Sometimes at night, I hear a dragging noise. Very faint. Very slow. Like something moving across the floor, except nothing ever moves." The words drained the color from the lead detective's face. "Where does it come from?" She pointed at the bedroom corner, the exact corner the neighbor beneath had identified 20 years earlier. The dragging sound. Always the dragging sound. A sound no forensic theory could explain. A sound that lingered across decades like a scar carved into silence. Another detective asked if she had ever seen anything unusual. The tenant hesitated, twisting her fingers together. "Once," she said. "I woke up and the window was open. I'm sure I locked it before bed. And there was a feeling. Like someone had been in the room even though I knew no one was." The room seemed to shrink further, compressing around the detectives until breathing felt difficult. They exchanged looks of silent dread. This wasn't the first time they'd heard such claims. Former tenants had reported insomnia, strange cold pockets, lights flickering at random hours. None of these reports had been taken seriously. They were dismissed as paranoia attached to a tragic legacy. But now, after the confession, the patterns felt less like coincidence and more like residue. One detective lifted the carpet near the bedroom doorway, searching for damage from years past. Beneath it, faint, nearly invisible scratches marred the wooden floor, parallel lines etched in the grain. Not deep. Not obvious. But real. They formed a small arc pointing toward the hallway. The detective stared, heart pounding. "These weren't here in the original photos," he whispered. The lead detective crouched down. "Age?" "Hard to tell. Could be decades. Could be months." The tenant backed away, shaking. As they documented the scratches, a sudden gust of cold swept through the bedroom, not from the window, not from the hallway. It seemed to rise from the floor itself, swirling around their ankles before dissolving into the air. One detective shuddered violently. Another grabbed his wrist instinctively, grounding him. At that exact moment, the tenant's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it, frowned, then turned pale. "It's a message," she said. "From an unknown number." The lead detective stepped forward. "What does it say?" Her voice broke as she read it aloud. "I think someone is in." The sentence ended abruptly. The exact message the victim had typed the night she disappeared. The unfinished warning frozen in her phone for 2 decades. The tenant dropped her device, backing against the wall as if the phone itself had turned into a threat. The room fell into suffocating silence. Detectives reached for their radios. The building, the cold case, the confession, everything was converging into a single point that felt like the edge of something monstrous. They evacuated the tenant for her safety, sealed the apartment, and contacted technical experts to trace the message. But no origin existed. No sender. No metadata. It was as if the message had generated itself, a ghost of the past repeating through circuitry. Back at the precinct, they returned to the man in the holding cell. He sat on the bench, staring at the wall, expression blank. When they entered, he didn't look up. But he spoke. "You went there," he said quietly. Not a question. A statement. The lead detective stiffened. "How did you know?" The man slowly turned his head. His eyes were damp, terrified. Because he always knows. "Who?" The answer came out as a whisper broken by trembling breath. "The man from the shadows." The detectives pressed him, but he wouldn't elaborate. He only repeated the same phrase, "He knows you opened the door." As they left the holding cell, a thud echoed from somewhere deep inside the precinct, distant, heavy, rhythmic. A dragging sound. Slow. Measured. Unearthly. Every officer stopped moving. The cold case wasn't just reopened. It was awake. The dragging sound that echoed through the precinct froze every trained instinct, slicing through the building's routine like a razor through fabric. Officers who had handled homicides, armed standoffs, and midnight confessions found themselves rooted to the floor by a sound too familiar to dismiss and too impossible to rationalize. It came from somewhere deep in the architecture, far below the holding cells, beneath the layers of concrete and steel that should have been silent. A slow, deliberate scrape. Then another. Then nothing. For a long moment, no one breathed. Radios crackled hesitantly, officers whispering updates with voices that betrayed more fear than professionalism. Everyone had heard the sound. Everyone knew what it resembled. And no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. The lead detective forced himself into motion, stepping toward the stairs with a resolve that felt borrowed, as if someone else had lent it to him. His partner followed closely, one hand hovering near her holster, though no weapon seemed appropriate against the kind of threat pressing at the edges of their comprehension. They descended to the lower level, each step sinking deeper into an atmosphere that felt heavier, thicker, charged with something electric and ancient. Lights flickered in a pattern too similar to the hallway bulb from 2003, sending waves of unease rippling down the stairwell. When they reached the basement, the air was colder, unnaturally so. Their breath fogged. The detective wiped condensation from his cheek, though no moisture hung in the room. Storage doors lined the hallway, metal drawers containing archived evidence, forgotten reports, sealed boxes of past tragedies. But one drawer stood slightly open, the latch unhooked, as if someone had pulled it gently moments earlier. It was drawer C17. The cold case drawer. Neither detective spoke. They approached slowly, hands trembling despite the silence they tried to project. When they reached the drawer, the lead detective placed a hand on the metal edge. It felt warm. Too warm. As if recently touched by a living hand. He pulled it open another inch. Inside lay the original case file of the third-floor disappearance, photographs, interview transcripts, the journal, and the final unsent message printed for archived review. But something new rested atop the pile. A small piece of torn paper. Fresh. White. Clean. Not part of any file. The partner leaned forward. Is that? The detective lifted it. 3 words, written in shaky ink. I saw you. A tremor shot through him so violently he nearly dropped the paper. No one had accessed this drawer in months. The room was locked. Surveillance covered every corner. And yet someone, or something, had placed a message directly on top of a file sealed 20 years earlier. Before they could process the implications, the power cut. Darkness swallowed the basement. A mechanical thrum rolled through the building, the kind that comes before emergency lights activate. But the backup generator hesitated, stalling for an unnatural stretch of seconds that felt like an eternity. In the pitch-black corridor, one sound rose, soft, steady breathing. Not theirs. Not human in rhythm. Something slower. Measured. Observing. The detective's hand clenched his flashlight. He clicked it once. Twice. Nothing. Beside him, his partner did the same with identical results. Batteries couldn't have died simultaneously. Not without reason. Then the emergency lights flickered to life, dim red strips illuminating the floor. The breathing stopped. The corridor looked empty again. But the drawer was now fully open. Back upstairs, officers scrambled, trying to track the power fault. Technicians ran through diagnostics. Everything indicated the outage wasn't a system failure. It originated from a manual override. Except no one in the building had triggered it. And the override switch in the basement remained untouched, sealed with a zip tie that hadn't broken. The detectives returned to the holding area, shaken. The man sat on the bench, back straight, eyes locked on the far corner of the cell. When they opened the door, he didn't acknowledge them. He whispered instead. He's here. The partner stepped toward him. Who? Tell us who you mean. But the man didn't look at her. His gaze stayed glued to the shadowy corner. I told you he doesn't use doors. His voice cracked. He doesn't need them. The detective felt something shift, an invisible pressure, subtle but undeniable, like the weight of a storm pushing through narrow walls. The temperature dropped again. The air felt wrong. The lights above them dimmed, humming with strain. The partner's hand moved instinctively to her shoulder radio. We need. Her voice cut off as the lights flickered violently, then stabilized. The man in the cell curled into himself, arms around his knees, rocking gently. He followed you, he whispered. You opened the door, and now he's inside the walls again. Detectives exchanged glances, fear sharpening their faces into gaunt masks. They needed answers. They needed clarity. They needed something to ground the investigation in logic before it spiraled into madness. A specialist, the same psychologist who had observed the initial confession, arrived moments later. She entered the cell cautiously, kneeling in front of the man. Her voice softened, steadying the room with practiced calm. Tell me why he came back. The man blinked slowly, eyes bloodshot. Because you're close, he murmured. Because the truth is almost out. He doesn't want the door open. What door? She asked. But his answer sent chills through every listener. The door she went through. Silence collapsed around them like a vacuum. He continued, voice breaking. It wasn't a place. It wasn't a hallway or a window. It was something else. Something he brought with him. The specialist pressed gently. Describe it. I can't, he whispered. Because I didn't see it. I only saw the darkness ripple. Like the room bent where he stood. Like the air folded around him. The detective's pulse spiked. The description echoed something written in the victim's journal, an entry from a week before her disappearance. The hallway seemed to bend tonight. Just for a second. Like the shadows were stretching to make room for something else. Investigators had dismissed it as exhaustion-induced paranoia. Now they weren't so sure. The man lifted his head suddenly, staring at the detective with a clarity that felt unnatural. He knows you found the scratches. The detective froze. How? But the man continued, eyes wide, voice trembling. And he knows she sent the message again. The specialist's breath faltered. How could you possibly know about that? No one told you. The man didn't blink. Because he wants you to stop. He's warning you. He warned her too. Detectives stepped out of the cell, closing the door with shaking hands. They convened in the hallway, tension coiled in their muscles. Something impossible was unfolding, and for the first time, they had no framework to contain it. The partner paced. This is beyond anything we can explain. We need physical evidence. Something irrefutable. Something that doesn't vanish into shadows. The lead detective thought for a long moment, staring at the message still stored on the tenant's phone. There's one thing we haven't done, he said quietly. We haven't extracted the victim's old hardware records. Her original phone was still in evidence storage, sealed, preserved, untouched for years. If the recent message somehow crossed into the tenant's device, perhaps traces, digital or otherwise, still lingered in the original hardware. Something measurable. Something testable. They retrieved the box containing the phone, journal, and personal effects, placing it on the examination table. As they unsealed the plastic, the room filled with the faint scent of dust and something else, something metallic, almost copper-like, as if the years had preserved more than memories. The phone powered on with difficulty, battery degraded, screen cracked. Technicians extracted its data through an external interface. Lines of code flickered across monitors, old texts appearing in digital threads. And then, abruptly, the screen displayed something that shouldn't exist. A new message. Dated today. Timed 3 minutes earlier. The same message. I think someone is in. The phone's battery died instantly. Not drained. Not fading to black. It shut off like a machine pulled from life support. Technicians backed away. The specialist whispered, This isn't possible." The partner's voice barely formed words. His reaching across time. But the lead detective, pale and trembling, stared at the message with a realization colder than the basement air. "No," he said. His not reaching across time. His voice hollowed into something raw. He never left. A sudden bang echoed through the precinct. A door slamming. A shout. Another bang. Chaos erupted as officers moved in waves toward the source. The holding cell. They sprinted down the corridor, panic surging through adrenaline. When they reached the glass, the scene inside froze their blood. The man was gone. No broken door. No forced lock. No open vent. Just an empty bench. And a single line scratched into the wall. "You opened the door." The cold case was no longer a case. It was a presence. A force. A truth breaking through every crack in the world. And this time, it wasn't hiding. The empty holding cell felt colder than the basement, colder than the apartment, colder than any place touched by the case so far. For several seconds, no one moved, no one breathed, no one dared blink. The bench where the man had sat only minutes earlier still held the faint indentation of his body, a reminder that he had been there, physical, real, terrified. And now he was gone as cleanly as breath vanishing into winter air. Officers swarmed the corridor, their radios blaring overlapping panic, but the lead detective stood motionless, staring at the scratched message on the wall as if it were the last remnant of a nightmare leaking into daylight. "You opened the door." The words carried the weight of accusation and warning, balanced on a blade that cut deeper the longer it was read. The partner approached the scribbled message, fingertips hovering over the grooves but never touching. "He didn't scratch this," as she whispered. "Not in the time he had. The marks are too deep, too deliberate. This took minutes, maybe hours." The specialist shook her head. "No. Not hours. Something carved this while the lights went out." The detectives exchanged a glance, one filled with a dread that had no place in police procedure manuals. Moments earlier, when the basement collapsed into darkness, the holding cell lights had flickered too. Just enough time. Just enough shadow. Just enough silence for something to move unseen. A shout from a nearby officer broke through the paralysis. No sign of forced exit. All doors still locked. Another voice echoed. "E-cameras went black for 8 seconds. We lost every angle." 8 seconds. 8 seconds of total blackout. 8 seconds in which a man vanished from a locked room without opening a door. It was the same impossibility that haunted the original case. The same pattern. The same silence. The same vanishing. The lead detective forced himself to speak, though his voice trembled. "Seal every exit. Search the entire building. Floor by floor. Room by room. Use thermal imaging, every radar tool we have. Just find him." Officers scattered into motion, their footsteps pounding through hallways that suddenly felt too narrow, too dark, too alive. Radios crackled with updates. Negative here, negative there, nothing on infrared, nothing on sensors, nothing on motion detectors. It was as if the building had swallowed him. The partner checked the ventilation system. Even if he were small enough to crawl through a vent, which he wasn't, the grates were screwed shut from the outside. She pulled on one grate anyway. It didn't budge. "He didn't get out through physical means," as she said softly. The lead detective looked at her, eyes hollow. "Then how did he get out?" She didn't answer, because no answer existed that belonged in the realm of law enforcement. Minutes later, a new detail surfaced, one that made the room spin. In the last recorded frame before the cameras cut, the man wasn't alone in the cell. A silhouette appeared behind him. Something tall. Too tall. Human-shaped, but elongated by shadow. Distorted. Standing exactly in the corner of the room where the man had kept his terrified gaze fixed. And in the frame after the blackout, both figures were gone. The specialist staggered backward, hand covering her mouth. No one can claim that's a lighting error. The lead detective turned away from the screen, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. He felt the basement cold again, crawling up his spine. We show this to no one. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with. But they didn't understand. Not even close. One officer entered, pale and shaking. "Sir, you need to see this." They followed him to the stairwell. At the bottom of the steps, faint markings trailed along the concrete, thin scratches, like something dragged lightly against the floor. But they didn't lead upward or outward. They started from the center of the stairwell landing and ended abruptly at the wall. As if whoever, or whatever, made them simply walked into the concrete. Before they could process this, the radios erupted again. "We found something on the roof." The detectives hurried up flight after flight, pushing through the rooftop access door into a biting wind that whipped at their coats. The sky above Berlin stretched heavy and low, the clouds bruised and shifting. Officers pointed toward the far corner of the roof. A single shoe sat near the ledge. The man's shoe. The partner knelt beside it, lifting it carefully. No footprints surrounded it. No scuff marks. No indication he had walked across the gravel-covered surface. The shoe looked gently placed, not dropped, not tossed. Behind them, an officer swallowed hard. "Do you think he jumped?" The lead detective stared at the ledge. It was a long drop, fatal. But the lack of any impact debris below made that explanation impossible. "No," he said quietly. "He didn't jump." The wind howled across the rooftop, a low, mournful sound that felt almost like a voice carried across distance. The partner shivered despite her layers. "Then what happened to him?" "He was taken," the specialist whispered. "Just like she was." Silence fell thicker than the clouds overhead. Downstairs, technicians continued to analyze the cell footage. They slowed it frame by frame until the final moment before the blackout. What they found made even hardened officers step away from the monitors. The silhouette behind the man didn't simply appear, it formed. As if the darkness itself condensed, thickened, and stretched upward into a shape. And in the last millisecond before the feed went dark, the man's body jolted forward, pulled by something unseen. A force with direction. A force with intent. The psychologist pressed her hands to her temples, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. He wasn't lying. He truly believed something followed him for 20 years. And now it's taken him. The partner asked what everyone feared. "Do you think it's the same thing that took her?" "I don't think," the specialist said. "I know." The lead detective slammed his fist onto the table, frustration breaking through fear. "This is not evidence we can present. This is not a case we can submit. This is something else entirely." "But the pattern is clear," the specialist insisted. "She vanished without a trace. He vanished without a trace. Both after signs of a presence that didn't follow physical rules. And both after warning us." "Warning us of what?" he demanded. The lights flickered overhead. Once. Twice. 3 times. A rhythm identical to the hallway bulb from 2003. Everyone turned slowly toward the corridor. A soft sound rose, so faint at first that it could have been mistaken for wind through the vents. But it grew, deepened, took on weight, an unmistakable cadence. A dragging sound. Moving up the hallway. Approaching the squad room. Officers backed away instinctively, some drawing weapons even though they knew bullets had no meaning against whatever was coming. The detectives positioned themselves near the center of the room, eyes fixed on the doorway. The sound grew louder. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. The emergency lights dimmed, casting the hallway in a blood-red haze. Then, silence. Heavy. Complete. The partner held her breath, muscles locked. Something pressed against the edges of the air, as if the space of the hallway was bending, folding, stretching to accommodate an unseen presence. A shadow flickered at the far end, not a shape, not a figure, just a ripple, like heat distortion but darker. The specialist whispered, trembling, "He's not after him anymore." The lead detective spoke through clenched teeth. "Then who is he after?" The shadow rippled again. This time closer. The air tightened like a noose around the room, and a frigid wave rolled across the floor, extinguishing every whisper of warmth. A phone vibrated on the desk. Every head snapped toward it. It lit up with a notification. A message. From an unknown sender. The same message. "I think someone is in." The screen flickered. Then went black. Someone inhaled sharply. But the lead detective felt nothing except the cold rising from the floor, pooling around their ankles like a tide. "He's not after a person," the specialist said, voice hollow. "He's after the truth." And then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the precinct so completely that for several seconds no one could even see the silhouette of the person standing next to them. The absence of light wasn't a simple outage, it was a presence, thick and oppressive, as though something enormous had settled across the building, smothering every bulb, every emergency diode, every scrap of illumination. Officers froze in place, breaths held, fingers trembling against useless flashlights. Somewhere in the void, a whispered gasp cut the air, too soft to locate, too sharp to ignore. The lead detective's pulse hammered in his ears as he tried to orient himself. He reached for the table, fingers brushing cold metal. The room felt smaller now, walls closing inward, compressing the air. A weight pressed on his chest, a familiar heaviness he hadn't felt since the first time he'd stood inside the victim's apartment 20 years earlier. The same suffocating stillness. The same feeling that the darkness wasn't empty but attentive. Someone fumbled for their radio. Static exploded, harsh and jagged, like an electrical scream. Then a voice broke through, not anyone in the precinct, not any human voice at all. It was layered, distorted, as if spoken from beneath water or through grinding metal. One word emerged, stretched into something unrecognizable yet unmistakable. "Closer." Officers recoiled, bumping into desks, into one another, into walls they couldn't see. The specialist clutched the back of a chair, knuckles whitening, breath shaking as she whispered to no one, "He's inside." "He's inside already." The partner grabbed the lead detective's arm, grounding him with the touch. "We need light," as she said through trembling teeth. "Any light. Even a phone screen." He reached for his phone, thumb sliding across the surface. Nothing. Dead. Not powered off, dead. A cold realization spread like ice through his bloodstream. He felt for his watch. The second hand wasn't moving. Time itself had stopped inside the precinct. A low rumble traveled through the floorboards, gentle at first, then growing, like the distant roll of thunder approaching from underground. The dragging sound returned, louder than before, vibrating through desks and filing cabinets, rattling window frames. But now it carried direction, purpose, an approach so deliberate it felt like a countdown. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. The rhythm grew closer, each drag longer, deeper, as though something heavy was being pulled across stone. One officer shouted, voice cracking under the terror, "Weapons out." But drawing weapons didn't steady their hands or their fear. The darkness swallowed the metallic clicks of slides being racked, consumed the outlines of guns lifted toward nothing. A sudden burst of cold air swept across the room, sharp as winter wind yet sour with the metallic scent of old dust and something else, something older, darker, familiar to anyone who had stood inside the third-floor apartment in 2003. The partner inhaled sharply, her voice trembling. It's the same smell. The same cold. The specialist's breathing quickened, panic rising. You have to listen to me. This isn't a person. This isn't a suspect. This is something that moves through presence, not space. It follows emotion. It follows memory. It follows open doors. The dragging sound stopped abruptly. Silence suffocated the room. Then a light flickered on, not overhead, but a small, flickering rectangle of blue-white, floating in the darkness at eye level. A phone screen. But not any of theirs. A phone far older, cracked, outdated, the same model taken from the victim's belongings earlier that day. It hovered in the air for a split second before dropping to the floor with a hollow clatter. The screen lit again. A message appeared. I'm here. Someone screamed. A wave of cold burst outward from the fallen phone, knocking several officers backward. Papers flew across the room in a swirling cyclone. The lights overhead flickered, sputtered, then exploded back to life all at once, flooding the precinct in blinding white. And the dragging sound ceased. The detective blinked rapidly, adjusting to the sudden return of visibility. Officers lifted their arms to shield their eyes. Others checked their weapons. Several froze, staring at the floor where the phone lay. It wasn't the victim's phone. It was the witness's. The man who had vanished. The specialist staggered toward it, kneeling with shaking hands. It wasn't there before, she whispered. It can't be here. It can't. Before anyone could respond, the phone vibrated violently and slid several inches across the floor, the movement sharp and purposeful, like a pointing gesture. It spun, stopping with its cracked screen facing the office's glass wall. Beyond the glass, in the hallway, lights flickered again. And a silhouette stood motionless at the far end. Not tall this time. Not stretched. Human-shaped. Exactly human-shaped. The partner's breath hitched. It's him. The witness. Or what resembled him. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. His face, barely lit by the stuttering hallway lights, looked hollowed out, like something had carved away the parts that made him human and left behind the shell. The lead detective stepped forward, despite every instinct screaming against it. Sir, he called softly. If you can hear me, stay where you are. We're coming to you. The silhouette didn't respond. It only stood, hands at its sides, face tilted upward, as if listening to something above them. The partner whispered, something's wrong. That's not how he stood. That's not how he moved. The psychologist's voice broke. It's not him. It's what took him. The silhouette's head twitched sharply toward the sound of her voice. The hallway lights surged, flared too bright, then dimmed. And the silhouette stepped forward. Not a step, not a walk, an instantaneous shift, as though distance folded around it. One moment it was at the far end. The next it stood halfway down the hall. Officers raised their weapons. The partner grabbed the detective's shoulder. Get back. But he didn't move. He couldn't. His feet were rooted to the floor, nailed there by some unseen force. The air thickened, pressing against him like invisible hands. His chest constricted. Breathing became shallow. The silhouette shifted again. Now standing directly outside the glass. Only inches away. Its face no longer resembled the vanished man. Only the outline remained. Inside, something dark churned. Avoid wearing a mask of skin. The lights flickered. The glass inched inward as though pushed by pressure from the other side. The specialist whispered, voice cracking with despair, "It doesn't want him anymore. It wants you. All of you. Anyone who walks through the truth." The lead detective stepped forward despite the crushing weight. "What do you want?" he shouted at the figure beyond the glass. For the first time, the silhouette moved with intention. It raised one hand and pointed toward the detective's chest. Then a sound filled the precinct, loud, sharp, unmistakable. A phone notification. His phone. The one that had been dead moments earlier. He looked down. The screen had lit itself. A message appeared. Not sent from a number. Not from a contact. From nowhere. You opened the door. The glass shattered. Not explosively, silently, terrifyingly, as if dissolving into dust. The silhouette leaned forward, crossing the threshold into the squad room. Officers stumbled backward, horrified. The temperature plunged, breath crystallizing in midair. The detective raised his weapon with trembling hands. "Stay back," he warned, though the command felt hollow in the presence of something that did not obey physics. The silhouette paused. Then another dragging sound echoed, this time behind them. Everyone spun around. On the opposite side of the room, the victim's original phone, still sealed inside its plastic evidence bag, began to vibrate violently, bouncing against the tabletop. The bag tore open. The phone lit. A message appeared. "He's here." The lights erupted in a shower of sparks. The room plunged into darkness again. And the silhouette moved. Not toward them. Through them. Parsing like a shadow through bodies, leaving behind a frost that burned skin and a dread so deep it lodged in bone. Someone collapsed. Someone screamed. Someone prayed. The dragging sound closed in from all directions now, circling them, rising like a storm surge inside the walls. The silhouette reformed near the far doorway, flickering, rippling, bending the air around it. The partner grabbed the detective's arm. "We need to go. Now." They ran. Through the hallway. Down the stairs. Past offices. Through the lobby. Doors slammed behind them without being touched. Papers fell from shelves. Lights pulsed like a heartbeat. Outside, rain hammered the pavement. The precinct lights flickered behind them, glowing and dimming in erratic waves. And as they reached the street, the lead detective looked back through the glass entrance. The silhouette stood inside. Completely still. Watching them. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "It's not done." They didn't sleep the night they ran from the precinct. They didn't go home, didn't shower, didn't dare be alone with four walls and a dark window. Instead, they regrouped in a nondescript conference room across town, the kind used for joint task force briefings and budget meetings, now pressed into service as the temporary heart of a case that no longer fit inside any category on paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, steady, bright, almost desperate in their insistence on normalcy. No flicker. No hum. No shadow moving where it shouldn't. For now. The lead detective stared at the whiteboard, its surface still empty, marker in hand, fingers trembling just enough that the cap wouldn't click on properly. His partner sat opposite him, elbows on the table, hands pressed against her forehead. The psychologist leaned against the far wall, arms folded tightly across her chest, not in defensiveness but in an attempt to hold herself together. They were officers, specialists, professionals backed by procedures and protocols. And yet every piece of training they had ever received had failed them in one brutal night. "This is still a cold case," the detective said finally, his voice rough. Berlin, 2003. A woman disappeared. No body. No suspect. No closure. That hasn't changed. Even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Everything had changed. The case had reached out from the past and taken someone from the present. It had torn a hole in the idea that time moves in one direction, that incidents have beginnings and endings, that evidence stays where you put it. Now, text messages jumped decades. Phones spoke when their owners couldn't. Doors closed on people without opening. "We can't report any of this," the partner replied, lifting her head, eyes red-rimmed but sharp. Not the silhouette. Not the messages. Not the whatever that was inside the precinct. "You know what will happen if we do. We'll lose our badges before we finish the sentence." She wasn't wrong. The detective could already imagine the headlines. Detectives cracking under pressure, officers hallucinating, psychologist feeding mass hysteria. The Berlin 2003 cold case would become a different kind of circus, one where their credibility collapsed in front of cameras. The psychologist stepped closer to the table, voice quieter than before but steadier, as if she'd made peace with something heavy. "If we can't report what's happening, then we document it. For ourselves. For whoever comes after us. We create a record of every anomaly, every message, every impossible event. Because this isn't the first time something like this has happened tied to that apartment." The partner frowned. "What do you mean, isn't the first time?" The specialist pulled a folder from her bag, one she hadn't opened in years. "In 2005, I was brought in on another case. Different building. Different district. A man claimed his wife had vanished from their locked bedroom. Same story, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no evidence of exit. The case went nowhere, buried in the chaos of the era. But there was one detail that never left me." She slid a photocopied report across the table. A highlighted line jumped out. Subject reported hearing a slow dragging sound overhead the night before the disappearance. The word dragging might as well have been written in blood. The detective read further. A neighbor heard footsteps in the hallway but saw no one. A text message on the woman's phone remained unsent. "Do you hear that?" Time-stamped minutes before she stopped existing on every traceable record. "Why didn't you bring this up earlier?" he asked. The psychologist's jaw clenched. "Because I didn't connect it until tonight. Because back then it was just another tragedy chalked up to imperfect memory and faulty reporting. I told myself the dragging sound was coincidence. I told myself I was projecting what I'd heard from the Berlin 2003 case. I chose the explanation that let me sleep." There it was again, that echo. Berlin 2003. The cold case that refused to stay in its box. The partner tapped the folder. "How many others?" The specialist hesitated, then pulled out another set of files. "More than you want to believe. Not all in Berlin. Some in nearby cities. Some in other countries entirely. Cases connected only by whispers and patterns no one wanted to see. A sealed room. A missing person. A dragging sound someone heard but couldn't prove. An unfinished message on a phone or computer. And always, always, the feeling that something was in the room with them before they vanished." The detective felt a cold weight settle behind his ribs. This wasn't one cold case. It was a chain. A series. A pattern stretching across years, borders, languages. The kind of thing that should have been spotted long ago, but only if someone was willing to believe in a threat that didn't fit any suspect profile. He stood, uncapped the marker, and wrote 4 words across the board in thick, uneven strokes. Pattern, not human predator. The room went quiet. That was the first time any of them had named it out loud. Not a stalker. Not a serial killer. Not a neighbor with a grudge or lover with a secret. Something else. Whatever it is, the partner said, it doesn't just take them. It uses them. It used him. It used her. It's using their devices. Their last words. Their fear. The psychologist nodded slowly. It attaches to the moment just before the disappearance. That final burst of terror, of realization, someone is in here. That's when it seems to anchor itself. That's when the message freezes. Not sent. Not deleted. Suspended. Like a door left halfway open. The word echoed, door. Not a wooden one. Not a metal one with a peephole and a lock. A different door. The one the witness had described, the knot place, the rippling darkness, the bending air. The detective drew a circle beneath the first line on the board. Entry point equals fear plus attention. He turned back to them. Think about it. The first time it appeared in our investigation, the case was being reopened. Files were being pulled. Journal read. Memories stirred. The witness felt it again because we brought everything back to the surface. So cold cases aren't dead to it, the partner murmured. They're food. The longer they stay unsolved, the more energy gathers around them. Obsession. Questions. Late-night theories. Headlines. Documentaries. People staring at the same photo for years, asking the same question. What happened to her? Maybe that's how it grows. The psychologist's voice grew even softer. Then what do we do? Ignore it? Bury the case forever? Pretend nothing is happening? The detective looked at the words on the board, at the empty chairs where other officers should have been, at the small tremor in his own hand. The headline flashed in his mind again. Berlin 2003 cold case solved. Unexpected confession shocks nation. The nation thought they wanted closure. They thought they wanted the truth. But what if the truth wasn't a confession and an arrest, but a presence that grew stronger every time someone dug deeper? He thought of the tenant on the 3rd floor and her trembling fingers as she read the message. I think someone is in. He thought of the witness, eyes hollow, whispering. He came back. He thought of the silhouette at the glass, hand pointing straight at him. We don't bury it, he said finally. We don't feed it blindly either. We investigate it like we investigate anything else. But this time, we accept that our suspect doesn't leave fingerprints or DNA. He leaves patterns. He leaves emotions. He leaves echoes. The partner frowned. Echoes of what? The answer formed slowly, painfully. Of fear. Of unfinished stories. Of people who step out of the world without a trace. The cold cases that never stop breathing. The psychologist pushed away from the wall, a new resolve settling behind her eyes. Then we start with Berlin 2003 properly. No more patchwork between shifts. No more occasional reviews. We map out every anomaly, every unexplained cold patch in that building, every tenant who heard something. We compare it with the later disappearances. We look for overlap, dates, locations, even weather if we have to. And the witness? The partner asked quietly. If he's still alive somewhere, trapped wherever the thing took him, the sentence trailed off, but the thought lingered. What if the missing weren't dead in the traditional sense? What if they were suspended on the other side of that half-open door, frozen in the moment of realization forever? The detective capped the marker and let it fall to the table. If there's even a chance they're not gone, we keep going. That's what we do. We chase the impossible because the possible stopped helping a long time ago. The room fell into a contemplative silence, heavy but focused. For the first time since the darkness swept the precinct, they had something resembling direction. It wasn't hope exactly. It was obligation. Responsibility. The weight that comes with knowing the story isn't finished and walking away isn't an option. The partner's phone buzzed on the table. Everyone froze. She stared at it for a long second before flipping it over. No unknown number this time. Just a news alert. She exhaled slowly, then read it aloud. Major outlets are already running with the headline. Berlin 2003 cold case solved. Unexpected confession shocks nation. They think we have our man. They think it's over. A bitter laugh escaped the detective. Then for the nation, it's solved. For them, the story ends here. A headline. A confession. A name to put on the file. He looked at the others, eyes dark. But we know better. We know the real story is what happens after the cameras turn away. The psychologist met his gaze. Which means we work in the shadow of a lie. The public believes the cold case is finished, when in reality, it's the most open it's ever been. The partner's jaw set. Good. Let them think it's solved. Less attention might slow it down. Fewer people feeding it. Maybe that buys us time. The detective nodded slowly. Time to trace the pattern. Time to go back to that building. Time to stand in that bedroom again and ask the right question, not who did this, but what opened the door. As if summoned by the thought, the lights overhead dimmed, not a flicker, not a failure, just a gentle sag in brightness, like someone had turned down the sun a fraction. The three of them looked up at the ceiling, then back at one another. No dragging sound. No text message. No silhouette. Just a quiet, undeniable reminder. He was still here. Not in the precinct. Not in the apartment. Not in any one place they could cordon off or sweep. He was in the story itself now, woven into every retelling, every headline, every late-night conversation that invoked his presence without knowing it. Every time someone whispered the phrase "a Berlin 2003 cold case," your attention turned like a spotlight, and something in the dark smiled. The detective leaned over the table, pressing his palms into its surface as if bracing for impact. His voice dropped to a low, steady murmur, the kind reserved for messages meant to echo down long corridors of time. You wanted a confession, he said, as though addressing both the nation and something listening beyond the walls. Fine. Here's ours. We opened the door. We looked too long. We listened too hard. We pulled a cold case out of the ground and woke something that never should have had a name. He straightened slowly, eyes hard. But now that you're awake, we're not running. You've taken enough people. You have enough unanswered questions. This time, we're coming after you. The room seemed to constrict for a heartbeat, the air tightening, reality bending just enough to remind them what they were up against. Then, from the corner of the table, the victim's old phone lit up one last time. Screen cracked, battery nearly gone. 4 new words appeared on the display. Then come find me. They stared at the message glowing on the cracked screen as if it were a living thing. 4 words, simple and devastating. Then come find me. The room felt suddenly smaller. The distance between the 3 of them collapsed into a tight, breathless circle of realization. This wasn't just a taunt. It wasn't a random glitch or a phantom notification. It was an invitation written in the voice of someone who shouldn't have been able to speak anymore, from a device that should have been incapable of lighting up at all. The partner swallowed hard, her throat dry. If that's him, she said quietly, then he's not gone. Not the way we think. The psychologist's eyes stayed locked on the screen. Or something is using his voice, as she countered, but even in her skepticism there was an undercurrent of grudging belief. Either way, it wants us to follow. It wants us to step through whatever door it opened for them. The detective's gaze hardened. Good, he murmured. Because I'm done being chased in our own city. It didn't take long for a plan to form, not because they knew what they were doing, but because they had nothing else left. The pattern, the messages, the dragging sound, all of it kept pointing back to the same place. The apartment. The 3rd floor. The crooked window where shadows bent and drafts whispered through sealed glass. If there was a door between here and wherever the missing had gone, that was the closest thing they had to a hinge. We go back tonight, the detective said. No uniforms. No squad cars. No noise. Just us, and whatever's waiting. The partner shook her head. We can't go in unbacked. You know that's insane. Bringing more people will just give it more to feed on, he replied. You saw what happened in the precinct. It doesn't care about numbers. It cares about stir. About fear. We keep the circle small. The psychologist stepped forward. If you're going back, I'm going with you. You're walking into a psychological event unlike anything I've ever studied. Whatever we find, or whatever finds us, needs to be documented in real time. Observed. Interpreted. The partner exhaled sharply. You're not a cop. No, the specialist said. But I'm the only one in this room who's been watching this pattern for 20 years. I'm not staying behind while you walk into the center of it. The detective looked between them, then at the phone still glowing faintly. The words remained. Then come find me. We go together, he decided. If this thing wants us inside that room, we go. But we go on our terms. Hours later, Berlin's night wrapped the city in a quiet so thick it felt staged. Streetlights cast pale halos across wet pavement. Traffic thinned to a distant murmur, as if the city had decided to look away from whatever was about to happen on one unremarkable block. They parked several streets away, walking the rest of the distance on foot. The building loomed ahead, the same mix of aging brick and half-hearted renovation that defined much of the neighborhood, but to their eyes it looked like a mouth, one that had already tasted too many names and wasn't done. The 3rd floor windows were dark, including the one with the crooked frame. Only a faint glow from another apartment hinted at life inside. The tenant had been relocated temporarily, under the guise of a structural evaluation. The building manager had been more than happy to hand over keys after a brief, carefully edited explanation. No mention of vanished witnesses or spectral messages, only the words of follow-up forensic review and the old case reopened. Bureaucratic magic. Official lies. Tools of survival. As they stepped into the stairwell, the familiar smell of old paint, damp stone, and the faint trace of cleaning fluid met them. It should have been comforting in its ordinariness. It wasn't. Every footfall echoed too loudly. Every shadow stretched too long. The 3rd floor landing waited above them like a held breath. When they reached it, the hallway light hummed steadily. No flicker. Not yet. The detective took out his own flashlight anyway, not to fight the dark, but to prove to himself that this time, it worked. He clicked it on. A clean beam cut through the space. He exhaled slowly. "See," he muttered under his breath. "This time we're ready." The psychologist glanced at her watch. "What time does her journal say?" she asked softly. The partner answered without checking. 3:21. That's when she heard the breathing. The last entry. The last moment we know she was still in this world. "We're early," the specialist said. "Good. Let's see what the room feels like before the pattern hits." The key turned in the lock with a soft, metallic snap. The door opened easily, the apartment greeting them with that same unsettling stillness that had haunted it since 2003. Furniture different, paint fresher, but beneath the veneer of new life, the old silence waited. Heavy. Patient. The detective stepped inside first, the flashlight beam gliding across the living room, the hallway, the kitchen. Everything in place. Nothing disturbed. The partner entered next, followed by the psychologist, who closed the door behind them with a trembling hand. The sound of the latch sliding into place echoed far louder than it ought to, like the click of a switch being thrown somewhere far beyond the walls. They didn't speak for a while. They just listened. To the fridge's soft hum. To the faint noises from other apartments. To their own breathing. "Remember," the psychologist said quietly at last, "we're not just here to witness. We're here to engage. Whatever it is has been responding to attention. To investigation. Its behavior changes when we look at it. Which means right now, it's watching us as much as we're watching it." "Comforting," the partner muttered, moving toward the hallway. Her gaze lingered on the spot where the victim's half-typed message had once glowed on an older phone. "I think someone is in." The phantom words seemed to hang in the air. She shivered. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, exactly as the current tenant had left it earlier that week. The crooked window faced the street, glass reflecting faint city glows. As they walked in, a draft brushed their ankles, rising from nowhere, carrying that same metallic tang from the precinct basement. The detective checked his watch. 3:14 a.m. 7 minutes. 7 minutes until the time that had been preserved in ink and terror across 20 years. "You feel that?" he asked quietly. The partner nodded. The psychologist hugged her arms tighter around herself. "Like the room's too small for us," as she whispered. "Like something else is already here and we're crowding it." They set up as best they could. The detective placed the victim's old phone on the nightstand, its cracked screen black but still heavy with recent impossibilities. The partner set her own phone beside it, camera open, recording. The psychologist took a small audio recorder from her pocket, turning it on with a soft click. "Verbal log," as she said quietly, her clinical tone warping under the pressure. Time, 3:16. Location, original scene of 2003 disappearance, third-floor bedroom. Attempting direct observation of repeating phenomenon tied to time marker 3:21. Her voice trembled slightly at the last number. The minutes stretched, elastic and cruel. The apartment grew colder. A faint buzzing filled the air, like distant electricity or insects trapped inside walls. The hallway light outside flickered once, then steadied. The detective's pulse raced. 3:19. His breath came shorter. He forced his voice to stay steady. "If you're there," he said into the stillness, "if you've been sending messages, watching us, taking people, this is what you wanted. We're here. We're listening." Show us how you opened the door. Nothing responded. No dragging sound. No silhouette. Only the hum deepened, the air thickening like slowly congealing liquid. 3:20. The psychologist's voice dropped barely above a whisper. I feel pressure in my chest as she murmured to the recorder. The same as in the precinct. Same as described by multiple witnesses across different cases. Air density has changed perceptibly. Breathing feels resisted. The partner reached for the detective's arm, fingers cold. No backing out now, she muttered, though the quiver in her voice betrayed the part of her that desperately wanted the option. He nodded once. We weren't backing out before, he replied. Now we're just waiting for the knock. 3:21. Nothing knocked. Instead, the breathing began. Slow. Deep. Not theirs. Not aligned with any of their chests. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once, as though the walls themselves had lungs. A long inhale, drawn through a space too narrow, then a ragged exhale that brushed across their skin despite no air movement. The flashlight beam shuddered as the detective's hand shook. The partner clamped her jaw, forcing herself not to flinch. The psychologist's recorder captured it all, the breathing, the trembling, the stuttering heartbeats. The victim had written about this breathing. About waking up to find the room occupied by something unseen yet undeniably there. Don't talk, the detective whispered. Just listen. The breathing quickened, matching no human rhythm, moving in strange patterns, as if tasting the room. Something unseen shifted near the window. The curtains stirred even though the glass remained closed. The draft rose again, swirling around their ankles, climbing up their legs like cold fingers. The victim's phone lit up. On its own. I think someone is in. The words appeared exactly as they had before, frozen mid-sentence, cursor blinking. But then, for the first time in 20 years, the text didn't stop. It continued. The cursor slid forward. Letters appeared, one by one, as though typed by invisible hands. The walls. The message completed itself. I think someone is in the walls. The breath left the detective's lungs in a jagged rush. The partner stumbled back, hand over her mouth. The psychologist grabbed the table to steady herself, eyes wide, whispering, it was never the room. It was never an intruder in the traditional sense. She heard it in the walls. She felt it moving around her. It didn't come through the door. It came from inside the structure. The breathing intensified, now clearly coming from behind the plaster, the wood, the brick. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, as if something large crawled just beneath their surface. A soft crackling sound joined it, the faint, brittle noise of paint straining, of old foundations shifting under unnatural weight. A line formed on the bedroom wall, a hair-thin fracture running from the ceiling toward the floor, then slowly branching, like a vein or a root spreading. The dragging sound started. Not from the floor this time. From inside the wall. It scraped downward, deliberate and slow, as though something massive was being pulled along narrow channels, dragging the fabric of space with it. The fracture widened, plaster dust falling like pale ash. The partner stepped back until her shoulders hit the opposite wall. We need to get out, as she gasped. We saw enough. We have it documented. We need to. The door slammed shut on its own, the frame rattling. The handle refused to turn when she lunged for it. The room contracted. The breathing, the dragging, the crack widening, everything crescendoed at once. The psychologist spoke through the terror, voice hoarse. This is what she experienced. This is her last 5 minutes playing out again with new witnesses. This is the pattern replaying itself whenever someone pulls too hard on the past. The detective stepped toward the cracking wall, body shaking. "If you want us to find you," he shouted into the sound, "then stop hiding in the walls and show us where you took them. Show us the door." For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The breathing. The dragging. The hum. Silence slammed into the room like a physical blow. Then the fracture in the wall split wide, just for an instant, revealing not pipes, not brick, not insulation, but a darkness so deep it had texture. It wasn't empty. It was full of absence, a hollow so complete it seemed to devour light from the edges of the opening. And in that darkness, just before it sealed again, they saw shapes. Not clear enough to identify, but enough to understand. They were not alone on the other side. The wall snapped shut. The crack sealed as if rewound in reverse. The breathing faded. The draft died. The phones dimmed. The bedroom light flickered once. Then held steady. The door handle turned easily under the partner's hand now. The hallway waited, strangely calm. The detective stood rooted in place, chest heaving, eyes locked on the section of wall that had opened. "You saw them," he whispered. It wasn't a question. The psychologist nodded slowly, tears streaking her face. "Not clearly," she said, "but enough to know they are still there. Somewhere between here and nowhere." The victim's phone vibrated weakly, battery hanging by a thread. One final message appeared. "Help us." The words didn't blink this time, didn't stutter or glitch. They sat perfectly still on the cracked screen, as steady as a headline. "Help us." Not a "help me." Not a single voice. A chorus. A cluster. A weight of missing lives pressing themselves into 4 letters and 2 words, using a 20-year-old device like a periscope pushed through the surface of reality. The room seemed to tilt, the floor not quite flat beneath their feet anymore. The partner whispered it out loud, barely able to shape the sounds. "They're aware. Wherever they are, they're conscious of us. Of this room. Of the moment." The psychologist's hands were shaking so badly she had to rest them on the bed. "That's why the messages keep repeating," she said. "Why the same sentence starts over and over but never sends. It's not a glitch. It's a frozen plea stuck between worlds, replaying every time someone pulls on the case." The detective stared at the phone, his reflection fractured across the cracked glass, his own eyes split into pieces. "We asked it to show us where they went," he murmured. "And it did. Just enough to make sure we couldn't walk away." They got out of the apartment because staying would have broken something in them that couldn't be fixed. The door opened easily this time, no invisible force holding it. The hallway light glowed steadily, pretending nothing had happened. The stairs creaked under their weight just like they had for decades. But the building felt different, as though every wall, every step, every nail now carried the echo of a sentence completed at last. "I think someone is in the walls." Outside, the night felt too open. Cars passed. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, someone laughed. Normal life threaded itself across the street while 3 people walked away from a door that was no longer just an address, but an access point to something that understood their names. Back in the temporary conference room, dawn creeping grey at the edges of the windows, they laid everything out. Not just the Berlin 2003 file, but the old cases the psychologist had mentioned. The 2005 disappearance with the dragging noise overhead. The other sealed room vanishings from other cities, other countries, each one a fracture in the logic of the world. They printed headlines, highlighted phrases, circled timestamps. Moving vanishes. Locked rooms. Unfinished messages. Neighbors hearing breathing or dragging just before silence. Maps peppered with pins. The board filled up fast, lines of red pen threading across continents like veins. The detective stepped back and took it in, the pattern stretching wider than anything they'd suspected. This isn't local, he said. This isn't even regional. This is global. A network of cold cases that look unrelated until you listen for the sound behind them. The partner pointed to the dates, lips pressed tight. Look at the clusters, she said. It spikes every few years. Each time, there's a major story attached to one of the disappearances that doesn't get solved. Coverage lingers. People obsess. Forums light up. Documentaries get pitched. The story starts feeding itself, and right when the attention peaks is she tapped the word missing beside a name. It takes someone else. The psychologist added, voice low, even when the attention dies down, it stops. Not completely. But it slows. Like it's watching where the world's eyes go, and choosing its moments. The detective saw it clearly now. The thing in the walls. The thing in between. It didn't just haunt spaces. It haunted stories. It burrowed into unsolved tragedies, nesting in them like a parasite, pulling power from every whispered theory, every click on an article, every late-night replay of the same grainy hallway footage. The Berlin 2003 cold case wasn't just a crime scene. It was a signal flare that had burned too long. He thought of the national headline already circulating. Berlin 2003 cold case solved. Unexpected confession shocks nation. A neat conclusion. A ticked box. A satisfied public. But the real story wasn't the confession. It was what came after. A witness taken. A precinct infected. A room where the wall opened like a throat. We have two options, he said, scanning both their faces. We bury this, pretend the confession is the real ending, file everything under stress-induced hysteria and electrical faults. Or we keep going, knowing that the closer we get, the more attention we give it, the more it grows. The partner laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Those aren't real options, she said. Because we already know what happens when we look away. It doesn't stop. It waits. It finds someone else to listen. Someone else to knock on the wall. The psychologist nodded slowly. And now there's this. She pointed at the last message. Help us. If those people are still aware, if they're trapped in whatever space we just saw, then walking away isn't just cowardice. It's abandonment. The detective felt the weight of that. Not just as an officer. As a human being confronted with a nightmare that somehow managed to be worse than death, to exist on the wrong side of a wall, forever in the moment before you can send a message asking for help. He picked up the victim's phone again, thumb brushing the cracked edge. If there's even a 1% chance they're recoverable, he said, we keep going. We have to. But we don't do it blind this time. We don't just wait for it to come to us. They needed a plan, something more than reacting to a breathing void in a bedroom. Something proactive. Something that treated the entity not as a ghost to fear, but as a pattern to corner. The partner leaned forward, eye scanning the moving pins, the circled dates. What if it doesn't just respond to attention in general, as she said slowly? What if it responds to coordinated attention? To specific ritualized focus on a case at a specific time? You mean like anniversaries, the psychologist added, picking up the thought immediately. Crime shows. True crime specials. Cold Case Retrospectives. Every time a network packages a story, millions of eyes land on the same moment, the same unsolved space. And that's when it eats, the partner said. The detective's mind spun, connecting threads. Every one of these spikes lines up with renewed media focus, he realized. Documentary airings. Commemorative articles. Podcasts. That's why the Berlin case woke up now. It wasn't just us reopening the file. It was the headline. The confession. The idea that the cold case was finally solved. It pushed the story back into the spotlight. And he used it to reach out. He could see the headline again, crisp and cruel, cold case solved. The lie was like a match held to dry grass. The psychologist took a deep breath, then said something that made the air around them tighten. Then we don't just investigate, she said. We weaponize it. The partner frowned. Weaponize what? The attention, she replied. The story. The way narratives move through people. If it uses our focus to reach out, we use our focus to force it somewhere we can contain it. We don't even know what contain means for something like this, the detective argued. It doesn't sit in a cell. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't register on cameras unless it chooses to. But it chooses, the psychologist insisted. It makes deliberate choices. It speaks. It responds. It baited you with that message. Then come find me. That means it has boundaries. Even if we don't understand them yet. They spent hours drafting something that didn't look like an investigation plan so much as a trap built from screens and timelines. They compiled every documented case that shared the pattern. They mapped them by date, time, media attention. They identified the anniversaries coming up, the nights when news outlets were likely to rear in segments, when online communities would resurface old threads. They planned around one in particular, the 20th anniversary of a highly publicized disappearance that had never been solved, 2 countries away but eerily similar to Berlin 2003. The showrunners of a documentary series had already announced a special revisit of the case. Millions would watch. Millions would feel that same familiar chill. Millions would whisper, "What happened to her?" We piggyback on that, the partner said. We set up in the place where she vanished, at the exact time the broadcast goes live. We bring recording equipment. We bring devices from other cases, anything that's carried his messages. We watch for the pattern to repeat. If he uses that surge of attention to open another door, we'll be standing right in front of it. And if it doesn't open, the detective said, or if it opens and this time it doesn't close? No one had an answer for that. The plan wasn't safe. It wasn't sane. It was the only thing they had that felt like action instead of surrender. Days blurred as they prepared. Officially, the Berlin 2003 cold case file was marked as resolved for public record, confession accepted, paperwork filed, press satisfied. Unofficially, the file thickened with notes nobody else would ever read. Transcribed messages. Unexplainable outages. Shadows on frames. A wall that opened like an eye. They moved quietly, avoiding colleagues, avoiding questions. Their world shrank to 3 people, a handful of devices, and a trail of ghosts that didn't know they were ghosts. The night of the anniversary arrived wrapped in rain and static. They traveled to another city without flashing lights, without permits, without backup. The location was almost insultingly ordinary, a small house on a quiet street, newly painted, garden trimmed. No plaques. No flowers. No sign that someone had disappeared here years earlier, leaving behind a family that refused interviews and a bedroom no one slept in anymore. The current occupants had allowed access under a strict agreement. No press, no disturbance, no explanation beyond a final forensic closure. The lie tasted bitter in the detective's mouth. But when he stepped into the bedroom where another unsent message had once frozen on another phone, he felt the same pressure in his lungs he had in Berlin. The same wrongness in the angles of the space. The same sense that the room was waiting. They set up again. Phones on surfaces. Cameras on tripods. Audio recorders in corners. The television in the living room tuned to the documentary channel, volume low but audible, a distant narration threading through the house, retelling the disappearance in that familiar slow, ominous tone. The cold case killer of the week. The voice spoke about timelines, last sightings, potential suspects. It didn't know the real suspect was listening. As the broadcast reached the point where the victim walked into her bedroom for the last time, the temperature dropped. The glass on the window fogged from the inside. The psychologist checked her recorder. Timestamp matched, as she whispered. We're overlapping the original moment. Same place. Same focus. Same collective gaze from the world. The partner stood near the wall, muscles coiled. He's going to use it, as she said. He's going to ride this moment like a wave. And he did. The television crackled. The narrator's voice distorted, then warped, as if something else were pushing through the signal. The words dissolved into a low, bass-heavy rumble that shook the floorboards. Every phone in the room lit up at once, even those without SIM cards, even those powered off. Screens flooded with notifications that had no sender. I think someone is in. Do you hear that? Help us. It's dark. Where are we? Over and over, from numbers that didn't exist, from contacts that had never been saved. An entire chorus of unfinished sentences spilling into the room. The dragging began again, this time in stereo, inside the walls, under the floor, above the ceiling. The house groaned as if under immense weight. The psychologist stared at the equipment, voice trembling. We're hearing multiple instances at once, as she said. Different years. Different locations. Different victims. All sinking to this one focal point. He's routing them through this moment. The detective realized, with a clarity that cut like glass, what that meant. This isn't just a trap for us, he said. It's a network hub. He uses anniversaries to connect all his doors. And right now, all of them are open. The wall to his right pulsed faintly, the paint dimming and brightening like a heartbeat under skin. He stepped closer, ignoring the partner's shout, ignoring the psychologist's plea. If you want us to find you, he said, speaking not to the entity now but to the voices behind it, he then pushed back. Don't just ask for help. Pull. Show us where you are. For a moment, nothing changed. Then the messages on the screens shifted. They stopped repeating fragments. They synchronized. All at once, across every device in the room, a single sentence appeared. Pull us through. The dragging sound reversed. Instead of something heavy being pulled away, it felt like something impossibly distant was trying to be dragged closer, clawing at the fabric between worlds, straining against whatever force held it back. The walls arched inward, not physically, but perceptibly, as though depth itself were changing. The room spun. The television in the living room went silent, the documentary blacking out mid-sentence. The detective planted his feet, staring at the wall that seemed to ripple. We can't open it fully, he shouted over the sound. If we do, we don't know what else comes through. The partner yelled back, so what, we leave them there? The psychologist's voice cracked, torn between terror and empathy. There has to be another way. A partial breach. A controlled opening. The entity answered in its own way. The lights went out. Not just in the house. Across the entire street. Windows up and down the block went dark in a rolling wave. Somewhere outside, a car alarm bowled into the silence, then choked off mid-wail. The only light remaining came from the devices in the room, from lines of text spilling faster and faster. His here, his here, his here, his. Then, abruptly, a new message. Behind you. They turned. Behind them, the air wasn't empty. It had depth now. Texture. A weight that pressed against their backs before they even turned. The dragging sound didn't move away or closer. It coiled, circling the room like something pacing just outside the edge of what the human eye was built to register. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then they turned. It wasn't a figure this time. There was no stretched silhouette, no human outline pretending to be flesh. The wall behind them had become thinner than paint, darker than night, as if someone had peeled away the surface of reality and left raw shadow exposed. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, like a black lung inhaling. Tiny hairline fractures spread from its center, spiderwebbing across plaster, and through those cracks something pressed outward. Not a hand. Not a face. A pressure. A presence. A crowd of voices packed into one silent scream pushing at the seam. The detective felt his knees weaken. This is bigger than one room, he whispered. Bigger than one case. The partner's voice shook. He's using every door at once. Every anniversary. Every story being watched right now. They're all feeding this. The psychologist stared, eyes wide, tears glinting in the unnatural light rising from the wall. There on the other side, as she breathed. All of them. Every missing person tied to this pattern. Every cold case that never cooled. They're pressed against that barrier, trying to get through. The phones lit again, flooding the room with a sick, flickering glow. Screens stacked with messages that didn't seem to come from any one device anymore. The words bounced from one to the next like static court in a closed loop. Pull us through. Please. He's watching. He's using us. It hurts. Help us. Don't let him. The dragging sound shifted, becoming a low, grinding roar, like concrete being dragged across concrete from inside the walls. The house shook. The documentary feed in the living room, silent since the blackout, glitched back in for a single second. The narrator's voice warped into something inhuman. The last moments, the last moments, the last, and then it cut off again. The detective stepped forward, closer to the warping wall, even as every survival instinct screamed at him to run. If we pull you through, he shouted, voice cracking, does he come with you? Does he come first? The messages shifted in unison across every screen. Yes. Always. He opens the door. We are behind him. The psychologist choked on a sob. It's not just keeping them. It's wearing them. It walks into rooms draped in people it's already taken. It reached us through him. Through the witness. Through her. Through every victim stepped on first. The partner grabbed the detective's arm hard enough to bruise. If we drag them out, we give him an open path. We don't know what he looks like without walls. Without constraints. We don't know what happens to everyone else. The dragging shifted again, accelerating, pounding like 1,000 chairs scraping across 1,000 floors at once. Dust fell from the ceiling in a fine grey rain. The wall bulged inward. For a split second, shapes surfaced in the darkness. Hands, mouths, eyes, overlapping, blurred, reaching. Not for him. Not for the partner. Not for the psychologist. For the room itself. For the story. For the only thread still connecting them to the living world. One face almost tore free. Her. The woman from Berlin 2003. She was half-formed, as if carved from smoke, features flickering, eyes wide with a kind of terror that had evolved into something more complicated, recognition. She saw him. Not through time. Not through memory. Through the wall. Her mouth moved, silently, before the phones caught up and translated the motion into text. Stop. Not like this. He staggered. We came to pull you out, he said, voice splintering. We came because you asked. The messages shifted again, fast, desperate, overlapping each other like voices crowding a microphone. We asked. He wants. He wants you to open. He wants someone to tear it wide. He can't. You can. Don't. Behind the flickering faces, something larger loomed. No shape. No form. Just a density, a darker darkness, a gravity that pulled at the edges of their vision, making the whole room feel like it was beginning to tilt toward that point. The psychologist clutched her recorder as if it were a lifeline. He rides the moment of empathy, as she realized aloud, horror dawning in her tone. He dangles them in front of us, begging for rescue, because he knows what we'll do. We'll tear down the wall ourselves. Her words sparked the detective into movement. He spun toward the doorway. Power, he said. Signals. Attention. He's using all of it. The broadcast. The phones. The grid. We can't shut him out there, he pointed at the wall, but we can starve him here. The partner understood instantly. Kill the house, she said. And not just this house. The whole line. The psychologist shook her head, caught between logic and dread. If we cut power to a whole block without authorization, we'll lose our badges before morning. And it might not work. It might. It might, the detective cut in, be the only thing between him and an open nerve to the entire world. They moved. Down the hall. Through the living room where the black screen glowed faintly with a frozen frame. A bedroom. Somewhere else. Another person's last known moment. Out through the back door into the rain-slicked yard. Shoes slipping on wet stone. The sky above was a solid sheet of charcoal. No moon. No stars. Just a low, oppressive ceiling pressing the night down close. At the side of the house, a metal panel waited, locked, tagged, stamped with city approval. The partner didn't hesitate. She drove the heel of her flashlight into the latch until it snapped, metal shrieking under impact. The box opened, revealing a maze of switches and meters humming with borrowed energy. Last chance to walk away, the detective said, even as his hand wrapped around the main breaker. The psychologist's eyes filled, not with fear this time, but with something like grim resolve. We can't free them, she whispered, glancing back toward the trembling bedroom window. But we can stop him from feeding on them tonight. The partner nodded. And we can decide, from this moment on, who tells the story and who doesn't. The dragging inside the house intensified. The wall was almost breathing now, each inhale pulling harder, each exhale sending a wave of cold air through the cracks around the window frame. The messages on the phones surged one last time. Do it. Please. Hurts. He's angry. Hurry. The detective pulled the breaker. The world dropped. The hum cut. The lights inside the house died. Across the street, other windows flicked dark in sequence. Street lights bowed out. The faint glow from the television channel finally surrendered. The only remaining illumination came from the sky itself, dim, washed out ambient grey. Inside, the dragging sound faltered, stuttered, and then fractured into 1,000 faint, disorganized scrapes, like something losing its footing. The wall screamed. Not with sound. There was no noise, no pressure wave, no shattering glass. The scream arrived in their brains, in the nerves along their spines, in the back of their teeth. Reality twisted for a heartbeat, the edges of the house warping, the sky seeming to bend toward the ground. Then it snapped back. Dead still. The dragging stopped. The breathing stopped. In the sudden quiet, their own heartbeats sounded obscene. Slowly, they walked back inside. The bedroom wall looked ordinary again. No fracture. No ripple. No pulsing darkness. The air tasted flat, stale, like a radio station that had just lost its signal. The phones lay scattered on the floor and furniture, dark and inert. The devices that had screamed with messages seconds earlier were nothing but glass and plastic now. One screen glowed softly. The victim's phone. Its battery indicator blinked red, almost empty. A single thread remained open on the display. Not a flood this time. Not a chorus. One message. Thank you. The detective's throat closed. Did we help you? He asked hoarsely, or just make it quieter? No response came. The battery icon flashed once. Then the screen went black for good. In the days that followed, the city told itself a different story. The anniversary special aired the next night instead, after the network corrected a broadcast fault. It pulled strong numbers. Viewers messaged each other in the dark, trading theories, naming suspects, praising the production value. Somewhere in the middle of it, a short scroll appeared at the bottom of the screen. A Berlin 2003 cold case solved. Unexpected confession shocks nation. A neat conclusion. A satisfying resolution. They loved it. They repeated it. They shared the headline like a charm against the dark. Officially, the Berlin file was closed. The witness was listed as unstable, his disappearance chalked up to flight, not vanishing. The precinct outage went down as electrical failure. The strange messages that had passed through seized phones became corrupted logs and the unrecoverable artifacts. The bedroom on the 3rd floor of that aging Berlin building was certified structurally sound, cleared for occupancy, then quietly left empty on the rental list a little longer than the others. Unofficially, 3 people met once a week in a room with no cameras and no microphones. Under lights they checked twice and wiring they watched like a suspect. They built a map no one else would ever see. They catalogued every cold case that carried a trace of that same pattern, dragging noises, breathing in sealed rooms, unfinished texts, unexplained outages, walls that seemed too close. They created a small, silent network of investigators in other cities, people who'd seen shadows bend without explanation and refused to call it exhaustion. They learned, slowly, how to starve him. Don't let stories fester into myth. Don't let unsolved cases linger in the spotlight for years like open wounds. Give families quieter answers when you can. Close files cleanly, even if the narrative doesn't sell. Don't throw anniversaries into the spotlight with ominous reenactments and dramatic voiceovers. Don't feed the walls. Sometimes, they heard the dragging faintly when they stayed too late at the precinct. Sometimes, a phone lit for a second with a phantom notification and went dark before they could reach it. Sometimes, standing in a hallway or a stairwell or under a crooked window, they felt the air press in and recognized the taste of an old, patient hunger. But mostly, there was silence. On a grey morning months later, the detective walked back to the Berlin building alone. No badge on display. No file under his arm. Just a memory that refused to loosen its grip. The third-floor hallway smelled of dust and detergent. The light above flickered once, as if in greeting, then steadied. The door to her old apartment was closed. Locked. No tenant name on the mailbox yet. He pressed his palm flat against the wall beside it. Cold. Not like before. Not alive. Just cold. Nation thinks we solved you, he murmured. They think the cold case is finished. They got their headline. They got their shock. Somewhere inside the wall, something shifted, only slightly, like a long, slow exhale. He waited for a message that didn't come. For breathing that never started. For a dragging sound that stayed buried. After a long moment, he stepped back. As he turned to leave, his phone vibrated once in his pocket. No ringtone. No notification icon. Just a single, short buzz. He glanced at the screen. No new messages. No missed calls. Only the old news alert still pinned at the top. Berlin 2003 cold case solved. Unexpected confession shocks nation. He stared at it until the words lost shape, then locked the phone and slipped it away. On paper, the story was over. On television, the story was tied with a bow. In the minds of people who loved mysteries, it slotted neatly into that comforting category. Cold case solved, justice served, the world a little safer than it had been the day before. But in the quiet spaces, between walls, between signals, between the last word of a headline and the next swipe of a thumb, the case still breathed. So did the other ones. The lost rooms. The unfinished messages. The nights when someone somewhere sits up in bed at 3:21 a.m., staring into the dark and thinking, without knowing why. I think someone is in. The detective walked down the stairs, each step echoing through the building like a newsreader's final line fading to static. He didn't hear the rest of the sentence. But somewhere, in a place with no time and too many walls, a chorus of voices still whispered the same two words through every crack in cable and silent phone screen that would listen. Cold case.